50 men, 200 years, one Oval Office full of secrets, scandals, and straight-up madness. These weren't just presidents. They were weirdos, warriors, prophets, pranksters, germophobes, nap addicts, and maybe, just maybe, a few ghosts. You know their names. But you've never seen them like this. Welcome to the strangest deep dive into the highest office in the land. This is the most bizarre stories about U.S. presidents. It gets weird. Fast. George Washington, the man who chopped down the cherry tree. Except, of course, he didn't. George Washington's mythos is like a snowball of powdered wigs, battlefield bravado, and revolutionary sincerity, barreling through centuries of folklore until it landed in your 5th grade history book. But behind the statuesque gaze and stoic portraits lies a far more bizarre, twitchy, human figure. The real George Washington, he was terrified of being buried alive. It was no passing fear. He left instructions firm, unambiguous that his body must be left above ground for 3 days after death, just in case he was, still in there. This wasn't just 18th century quirk. The man who wouldn't tell a lie was also haunted by the idea of screaming in a coffin 6 feet under. Call it colonial claustrophobia. And while we're down this rabbit hole, let's stay a while. Washington also believed in omens, specifically owl calls. He was convinced their nocturnal hooting foretold death. Imagine this, the father of his country, peering out the window at Mount Vernon, hearing a hoo and muttering, "Well, that's it for someone." Not exactly the marble hero of national memory. His paranoia didn't stop at death. Washington feared the mere act of being seen in his undress, a term which, in his day, meant jacketless. Even his most trusted aides rarely glimpsed him in such a vulnerable state. He crafted his image meticulously, all the way down to his underwear, which, by the way, was padded, not for comfort. For posture, regal posture. Every button, every buckle, a choreographed move in the theater of respectability. And then there were the teeth. Oh yes, the teeth. Wooden? Nope. Try hippopotamus tusk, lead, gold, and possibly no, definitely human teeth purchased from enslaved people. His dentures were a dental horror show, and they caused him so much pain that he rarely smiled. Imagine running a country while your mouth feels like it's full of gravel and regret. Now, it would be a disservice not to mention Washington's pets. Dogs, sure, foxhounds even. But names? Sweet Lips, Drunkard, Tipsy. That's not a presidential kennel, it's a founding father frat house. These weren't just animals. They were an extension of Washington's personality. Precise in public, peculiar in private. But perhaps the most bizarre relic of Washington's legacy isn't what he wore, what he feared, or even what he chewed on. It's what he left behind, a set of handwritten rules of civility, copied out as a teenager. These 110 rules included instructions like spit not into the fire and kill no vermin as fleas or lice in the sight of others. That last one, hauntingly specific. Washington sculpted himself into a statue before the country had a chance to do it for him. And yet, peel back the powdered layers, and you'll find a man haunted by omens, obsessed with order, addicted to appearances, and just a little bit terrified of every creak in the night. Which brings us to his successor, a man who didn't just write the rules of civility, he tried to enforce them with manure, nail-biting, and a pet parrot that may or may not have cursed out his guests. Enter John Adams. John Adams. If George Washington was the marble statue, John Adams was the twitching man behind the curtain, muttering about compost and personal vendettas. America's second president was many things. A revolutionary, a philosopher, a diplomat, but also, quite possibly, the most anxious man ever to hold the office. His life was a cocktail of brilliance, neurosis, and a healthy dash of colonial gossip. Start here. Adams once proposed that the presidency should be hereditary. Yes, the man who helped birth a republic flirted with monarchy light. It didn't stick, obviously, but the idea bubbled up from a deep obsession with legacy. Adams didn't just want to lead the nation, he wanted to be remembered for doing it correctly. And when he felt forgotten, he kept a diary log of how many people respected him each day. Spoiler, not enough. His self-awareness was blisteringly sharp. "I am obnoxious and disliked," he once wrote of himself. This wasn't self-pity, it was just Tuesday. He would walk in perfect circles on his lawn, muttering through stress or strategy, while his neighbors peeked through their shutters and whispered, "There he goes again. And let's not forget the nail-biting." Adams chewed his fingers raw during debates. America's independence? Signed in sweat, spit, and shredded cuticles. But beneath the political rigor was a man with very real, very strange fears. He was a hypochondriac, convinced that death was around every corner. He tracked his bodily functions like a stock ticker pulse, urine, the works, and yet he drank a tankard of hard cider every morning. Good for the Constitution, he claimed. It was like waking up with a hangover and immediately ordering another round for breakfast. Adams also loved manure. Not metaphorically, literally. He wrote letters to his sons detailing composting techniques and soil quality. When other men dreamed of statues, Adams dreamed of fertilizer. A nation must be well fed, he'd argue, probably while elbow deep in horse droppings. He talked to himself, loudly, not just muttering but full-on conversations with imaginary adversaries. This made political negotiations interesting. Imagine meeting the president and realizing he's already halfway through an argument with himself. And if he wasn't monologuing, he was gossiping. Adams exchanged juicy tidbits with Abigail like 18th century TMZ, including his deep jealousy of George Washington's godlike image. He also had a feud with Benjamin Franklin, whom he called lazy and overly fond of French luxury. Meanwhile, Adams sat in his boots he wore for over a decade, writing angry letters and practicing law with such intensity that juries cried, actual juries, wept, from his arguments. Oh, and the parrot. Let's not forget the family pet that learned to swear. Whether from John or Abigail is unclear, but it cussed like a sailor during tea. A true founding fowl. John Adams died on the 4th of July, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. His last words? Thomas Jefferson survives. He was wrong. Jefferson had died hours earlier. 2 revolutionaries. 1 day. Cosmic timing. But Adams' legacy doesn't end there. Because if he was the neurotic father of the Republic, the next man was the Renaissance vampire Uncleth, architect of enlightenment, spaghetti enthusiast, and possible mammoth hunter. Get ready for Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson. If John Adams was a storm of nerves and manure, Thomas Jefferson was the calm that followed, except the calm was filled with clocks, pasta, and an unrelenting need to catalog the world. Jefferson wasn't just a president. He was a collector, a constructor, a compulsive note-taker, and not in moderation. No, Jefferson did everything with Enlightenment fervor and just a touch of enlightened madness. Let's start with the pasta. Jefferson didn't just like macaroni and cheese, he imported a pasta-making machine from Europe, brought back recipes, and personally made sure mac and cheese was served at White House dinners. The man who penned the Declaration of Independence also declared war on bad noodles. Guests would show up expecting political conversation. Instead, they got al dente diplomacy. But culinary experimentation was just the beginning. Jefferson believed the American West still harbored mammoths, full-sized, trumpet-nosed mammoths. He sent Lewis and Clark partly to find proof. And while they brought back plants, maps, and a general sense of, nope, no mammoths, Jefferson didn't let go of the dream easily. He even had a moose shipped to France to prove that American animals were superior. It died en route. Still, the point was made. Kind of. Jefferson's estate, Monticello, was part home, part scientific observatory, part museum of Jefferson. Clocks lined the walls, their mechanisms dangling through holes in the ceiling. He had so many timepieces that some guests reported hearing a faint ticking in their dreams. He also designed a mechanical rotating closet that turned between rooms like an 18th century Batcave gadget. Laundry? Unimportant. Convenience? Everything. And speaking of inventions, Jefferson created his own version of the polygraph. Not the lie detector, the Jefferson polygraph was a dual-pen writing machine that copied letters as he wrote them. It was analog cloning. Thousands of letters, copied, logged, and preserved. He wrote over 19,000 in his lifetime. The man was a human printer. He wasn't into speeches. Hated them, actually. His voice was faint, his delivery mumbly, and he loathed confrontation. Most of his battles were fought with passive-aggressive letters, eloquent, heavily footnoted, and usually smuggled in invisible ink. Jefferson also rewrote the Bible. Yes. Took scissors to the New Testament, snipped out all the miracles, and kept only the moral teachings of Jesus. No resurrection, no water into wine. Just a clean-cut, rationalistic gospel, the Enlightenment edition. He kept a pet mockingbird named Dick, who sat on his shoulder and sang while he worked. Also, a pair of bear cubs, just for a while. They were a gift from Zebulon Pike, and Jefferson kept them on the White House lawn like an eccentric Bond villain. Let's not forget the clocks, though. Jefferson didn't just own them. He watched them. He measured them. He obsessively logged the weather, temperatures, wind direction, and moon phase, day after day, year after year, as if reality could be tamed if it was simply cataloged enough. But all this precision had its dark side. Jefferson rarely slept more than 5 hours. He believed cold baths kept disease at bay. He was obsessed with debt, terrified of it, yet died owing massive sums. He designed his own tombstone and pointedly left off the fact that he had ever been president. And then, in a twist worthy of historical fiction, he died on the 4th of July, 1826, just hours before his old rival and kindred spirit, John Adams. 50 years to the day after the Declaration they'd both helped birth. But if Jefferson was the philosopher king who built worlds out of letters and latitude, then his successor was a man who barely reached the lectern, whispered when he spoke, and carried the weight of a republic in a body barely breaking 100 pounds. Enter James Madison. James Madison. James Madison was small, historically small. At just over 5'4" and roughly 100 pounds, he was closer in stature to a modern-day jockey than a commander-in-chief. And yet this quiet, twitchy, almost ghost-like man helped write the U.S. Constitution, co-authored the Federalist Papers, and outmaneuvered louder men in rooms where his voice barely registered above a polite cough. He didn't like public speaking. In fact, he was so soft-spoken and prone to mumbling that large gatherings were a kind of torture. He once fainted during a congressional speech, not from illness, from pure uncut stage fright. Imagine trying to rally a nation and collapsing mid-sentence like a broken wind-up doll. He was a man of routines, obsessions, and deeply strange beliefs. Like many Enlightenment thinkers, Madison believed that everything, even emotions, could be balanced through diet. He thought red meat and garlic made people angrier, so he ate like a monk, bread, vegetables, the occasional sip of buttermilk. It wasn't just health food, it was behavioral alchemy. But food wasn't his only experiment. Madison believed that weather influenced clarity of thought. He logged temperature, wind direction, barometric pressure daily. If the breeze hit just wrong, he might delay a decision. He wore wool stockings year-round, even in the Virginia heat, convinced it stabilized his humors. It didn't. It just made people think he had terrible fashion sense. Despite writing the Bill of Rights, Madison never held a job outside academia or politics. He was a lifelong intellectual, but not a man of the world. He never rode horses in later life, not out of fear, but because he thought the jolting movement might dislodge something vital inside, like a human snow globe. He distrusted dogs, refused to own one, said their barking disrupted his concentration while reading Latin and Greek. He did, however, love invisible ink, even for mundane correspondence. He wrote secret codes about dinner plans and book purchases, just in case British spies cared about his reading list. Madison had a nervous tick rubbing his hands during heated arguments. It wasn't aggressive, it was barely perceptible, but it was constant. He also refused to look into mirrors, believing vanity was corrosive to the soul. His personal philosophy seemed built on the idea that restraint equals righteousness. His handwriting? An angular maze. Historians still squint at it like it's a cryptic treasure map. He didn't sleep much, 4 or 5 hours a night. He read philosophy until sunrise, sometimes muttering responses aloud to the books as if Plato were sitting beside him, arguing about tax policy. And he was terrified of being buried alive, like Washington. He left instructions: keep the body above ground for days. Don't rush, don't assume. In case, he was still in there, whispering constitutional amendments under his breath. Despite all this fragility, Madison lived to 85, the longest living founding father. His critics saw a delicate academic, but in truth, he was iron wrapped in lace, quiet, steady, meticulous, paranoid. And after 4 terms of brainy, twitchy, nerve-ridden presidents, America was about to elect a man who looked like he walked out of a Revolutionary War wax museum, still armed and suspicious. He dressed like history, he talked to busts, and he may have predicted the weather by smell. Welcome to the peculiar, powdered world of James Monroe. James Monroe. James Monroe looked like he had stepped out of a painting and not a modern one. He clung to the powdered wig aesthetic well into the 19th century, like the Revolutionary War never really ended for him. His clothes were a few decades behind, his worldview even older. And if Jefferson cataloged knowledge and Madison agonized over the Constitution, Monroe did something stranger. He sniffed the weather. He could smell rain coming. Not in the poetic sense, he literally claimed he could detect weather changes by scent. Guests at his estate would catch him standing in doorways, nostrils flaring like a bloodhound, and then he'd calmly announce a thunderstorm was coming, and most of the time, he was right. Monroe didn't trust banks, or paper money, or hot baths, which he believed drained the body of vital energy. He took only cold baths, even in winter. He once mended his own coat rather than visit a tailor. And while most of his contemporaries upgraded their wardrobes, Monroe stubbornly clung to breeches, powdered wigs, and silk gloves indoors. In July, because dignity. He named the trees on his property. Not just metaphorically, he literally gave them names and treated them as friends. He spoke to busts of ancient philosophers when alone. Allegedly, he'd ask them for clarity. Imagine walking in on the President of the United States, whispering to a stone replica of Cicero in his study. Just another Tuesday at the Monroe estate. He believed dreams held practical meaning, not symbolic, not spiritual practical. As in, he would sleep in different rooms, even different positions, to channel useful thoughts from his subconscious. He counted stairs aloud as he climbed them, believing it gave him control over his surroundings. He also avoided mirrors, claimed they distorted character, not just reflections. Monroe didn't like to eat in front of strangers. Said it made him feel animalistic. He wore a custom waistcoat embroidered with tiny Englishes, Lucky Charm. He refused to eat honey, which he called the sugar of deceivers, and banned the word nice from his household vocabulary, calling it a dead word. To Monroe, nice meant nothing, which made it dangerous. He never spoke during the first hour of each morning, not a single word. Guests were informed in advance. You may be offered coffee. You will not be offered conversation. He also collected stones from every U.S. state, called them his Union bones. They were stored in a hidden drawer and occasionally polished by hand. When he died in the 4th of July, 1831 HE became the third president in a row to die on Independence Day. After Jefferson and Adams had already pulled off the historical coincidence 5 years earlier, Monroe followed them like the closing note of a bizarre patriotic trilogy. But the weirdness doesn't slow down from here, because up next is a man who swam naked in the Potomac, gave himself daily moral grades, and kept a pet alligator in the White House. That's not a metaphor. That's just John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was born into history, but he lived like a man trying to escape it, preferably by walking 5 miles a day, often barefoot, while talking to himself and staring at birds. He was the son of a president, a diplomat by age 14, a scholar, a lawyer, a congressman after his presidency, and yet he's best remembered for swimming nude in the Potomac River every morning, even during his presidency. No guards, no swimsuits, just a statesman and some cold, murky water. One female journalist once tried to secure an interview by sitting on his clothes until he agreed to speak with her. She got her interview. And then there was the alligator, a real one, a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette. Adams kept it in a White House bathroom as a kind of live diplomatic curiosity. Visitors would open the door expecting porcelain and find a prehistoric death machine hissing in the corner. Adams loved it, said it added moral tension to the executive residence. He believed in omens, dreams, birds, weather patterns. She logged them all. He kept a journal every single day for over 60 years. That's more than 15,000 pages. He graded his own behavior in that journal, giving himself letter grades like a self-assigned moral report card. One entry might read, "Avoided wrath, B-, must strive for detachment." This was a man whose spiritual workout routine made the Stoics look lazy. He walked constantly. He once hiked 20 miles in a single day to clear his mind, barefoot, talking to birds, quoting poetry, and occasionally fencing with invisible opponents. He believed in barefoot walking as a kind of natural lens polish. It would, he claimed, improve eyesight. He recorded the exact number of letters he received each year, and yes, he tracked who replied late. He sang hymns to himself during walks. He composed poetry in his head. He practiced fencing in his 60s at dawn. He refused to wear warm clothing in winter, claiming it built character. He lectured strangers on morality if they swore in his presence. He once walked backward up a hill because he thought it would reorder his thoughts. He believed silence could be weaponized and sometimes went entire dinners without speaking a word, not out of protest, out of principle. Adams trained himself to read upside down, just in case he needed to read across a table without turning the page. He believed the moon influenced human behavior more than any known force. He gave unofficial names to every bird he cataloged in his journals. He believed dreams about fire symbolized forgotten obligations. He carved inspirational quotes into tree trunks during solitary hikes. He once refused to eat at a royal banquet because he found the table centerpiece immoral. He hated his own birthday and never celebrated it. He died at his desk in the Capitol building, after suffering a stroke, literally collapsing in service. His final words? "This is the last of Earth. I am content." But don't get too sentimental, because next comes a man who believed owls were unlucky, carried a bullet in his chest for decades, and beat an assassin with his cane after both pistols misfired. The White House was about to get loud. Here comes Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson didn't enter history. kicked the door open, tossed his hat on a flaming table, and dared the room to flinch. If previous presidents had been Enlightenment thinkers, Jackson was a force of unfiltered frontier rage, powered by duels, dysentery, and a personal philosophy best summed up as, "Try me." Let's start with the duels. He participated in over 100 of them, not arguments duels, with pistols, with real bullets. In one of them, he took a shot to the chest, stood upright, returned fire, and killed the man. That bullet? He carried it in his body for over 40 years. Because removing it might have killed him. Because medicine in the 1800s was basically just bite something and hope. Jackson was the first president to survive an assassination attempt. A man walked up, point blank, and fired not one, but 2 pistols. Both misfired. Jackson didn't run. He didn't freeze. He turned, cane in hand, and beat the would-be assassin until bystanders dragged him off. He was 67 years old at the time. And he wasn't done. Jackson hated banks. Not the idea, not the policy. He hated them like a man hates an enemy. He once paid off the entire national debt, the only president to ever do it. He then stuffed his personal money into jars and buried them around his property. Financial planning, Jackson style. He had a parrot. It swore, loudly. At his funeral, the bird had to be removed because it wouldn't stop cursing. Jackson would have laughed. He once referred to Congress as a bunch of crows pecking at a corpse. His own cabinet members feared his temper, and they were right too. He swore so frequently and creatively that staff began inventing code words for his rants, just to make transcripts printable. His favorite insult? Carved into a tree near his neighbor's landline, just Jackson, venting into the bark. Jackson believed owls were harbingers of doom. If one perched near his house, he'd shoot at it with a shotgun. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow and a cannon outside his bedroom window. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. He called dinner parties a waste of bourbon and breath. He hated being photographed. Hated banks. Hated paper money. Trusted dogs more than people. Gave everyone nicknames. Sometimes flattering, sometimes not, sometimes for furniture. He believed cats were spies for witches. Would not allow one in the White House. He had a horse named Sam Patch, after a famous daredevil. He believed Congress was full of cowards. He chewed tobacco constantly, spat it on the floor of the White House, even during cabinet meetings. Because if you're going to run the country, you might as well do it your way. When he died, he claimed he had done God's work. His critics weren't so sure, but one thing's certain, no one forgot Andrew Jackson. And that brings us to a man who hated nicknames, wore lavender-scented gloves, and once hosted an all-orange dinner. From the backwoods to the ballroom, next up is Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren wasn't a warrior, wasn't a revolutionary, and never fired a shot in anger, but don't let that fool you. The 8th President of the United States was a master of political chess, nicknamed the Little Magician. Not because he pulled rabbits out of hats, but because he pulled elections out of thin air. Slick, smooth-talking, and 5'6" with fashion sense sharp enough to cut glass, Van Buren was the country's first true political operator and one of its most bizarre presidential characters. Let's start with the wardrobe. Van Buren obsessed over fashion. He wore extra-tight trousers and lavender-scented gloves. His sideburns were legendary. He once spent nearly an hour just grooming them before a dinner party. His closet was curated like a museum. If there were Instagram influencers in the 18 to 30s, he'd have been the first. He hated nicknames, which is awkward, because he had dozens. The Little Magician, Red Fox of Kinderhook, Slimart, but he refused to acknowledge them. Once, a man called him Marty to his face. Van Buren refused to let him into a meeting. Straight denial of entry, for a nickname. And yet, despite his formal exterior, the man hosted a dinner where everything was orange. The food, the decor, the napkins, the candles. One long citrus-toned hallucination. No explanation, just vibes. Van Buren also collected walking sticks. Not a few, hundreds, especially ones with secret compartments or bizarre carvings. He stored them in boxes, labeled and cataloged like a cereal cane hoarder. He kept peppermint candies in his coat and handed them out to visitors like a Dutch Santa Claus. He never drank, yet threw lavish parties loaded with booze because politics. He once refused to answer a yes or no question on the grounds that truth resides in the gray. Classic Van Buren. Everything controlled, nothing confirmed. He often read aloud to himself in dramatic voice 7 in public parks. He gave nicknames to trees, wrote thank you notes to them too. Your leaves were especially noble this season. A direct quote. He hated the color red, said it made people distrustful, so he avoided it in clothing, upholstery, even flowers. He believed sneezing was a cosmic signal. If someone sneezed 3 times in a row, he'd stop a meeting to reflect on its meaning. And let's not forget the goat. Van Buren had a pet goat that roamed the White House lawn. It wasn't just for laughs. It was a symbol, he said, of independent stubbornness. That goat understood Van Buren better than most members of Congress. Despite his refined public image, he died believing he would be remembered more as a stylist than a statesman. And honestly, he might have been right. But Van Buren's careful tailoring and social maneuvering couldn't have prepared the White House for what came next. A man who braved icy rain without a coat, gave a 2-hour inaugural speech, and died 31 days later. The shortest presidency, the longest speech. Buckle up. Here comes William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison didn't believe in bad weather. Or, more specifically, he didn't believe weather applied to him. Which is how the 9th President of the United States ended up delivering the longest inaugural address in American history, nearly 2 hours outside, in freezing rain, without a coat or a hat. He was 68. A month later, he was dead. Pneumonia. Shortest presidency ever. 31 days. But that's just the headline. The real weirdness of Harrison lies beneath the tragedy, layered in odd habits, backwoods superstitions, and a personality that swung wildly between battlefield bravado and deeply personal quirks. He studied to be a doctor before becoming a general. He hated the sight of blood. Try reconciling that with a military career. He chewed tree bark regularly, believed it helped digestion. He also believed the smell of burned orange peels could ward off illness. Citrus sorcery, frontier edition. He slept fully clothed, even in boots, not just during war, but at home, in his own bed, full uniform, like he expected the British to come bursting through the window at any moment. He refused to use forks, called them unmanly prongs, preferred to eat with knives, spoons, or when no one was watching his fingers, at formal dinners, as president. And the man was superstitious to a level that would make a Victorian seance host blush. He hated mirrors, covered them at night, believed they could trap dreams or twist your soul. He also thought thunder was God shouting at fools, which might explain his personal motto, don't be a fool, or at least don't get caught during a thunderstorm. He kept a musket above his bed until the day he died. Not for show, for use, just in case. He hated clocks, refused to own one, claimed time should be felt, not seen. His favorite accessory? A red ribbon tied inside his coat. Never explained why, never took it out. Harrison had dreams. Big, strange ones. He kept a dream journal, logged every symbol, every ghostly figure, every warning from the subconscious. He believed sneezing revealed a person's soul alignment. If you sneezed during a conversation, he'd pause, reassess everything, and maybe decide you were lying. He once tried to domesticate a raccoon, named it Judge Grumble. It escaped. He believed in true rest, which meant sleeping on bare floors. No beds. Beds were lies. He kept candles in fire prisons, his words, and hated violins, calling them whining wood. His speeches often devolved into long, rambling toasts about history, mortality, and the soul of republics. And yet, despite all this oddity, the most bizarre thing about William Henry Harrison is what he left behind: a ghost story presidency. He died so fast. No policies were enacted, no scandals erupted, no battles were fought. Just a storm, a speech, and then silence. Which is when things got strange again. Because his successor wasn't just an accidental presidency, was his accidency. A man with 15 children, a fear of silverware, and a personal vendetta against Thursdays. Prepare yourself for the lyrical madness of John Tyler. John Tyler was a constitutional glitch. A vice president nobody expected to lead, until William Henry Harrison keeled over from that legendary wet, hatless speech. And just like that, Tyler became the first man to ascend to the presidency without being elected to it. The newspapers called him his accidency, and the nickname stuck harder than his policies. But Tyler wasn't just a footnote in the rulebook of succession. He was a one-man parade of oddities, contradictions, and whispered superstitions, drifting through the White House like an antebellum fever dream in velvet slippers. Let's start there. The slippers. Tyler wore velvet house slippers to state dinners. Not as a protest, not as a comfort choice, just because. He called formal shoes foot prisons. He also believed Thursdays were cursed. Never shook hands on that day. If a diplomat extended a palm, Tyler would grimace and step back. Not today, he'd say, and leave them hanging. He had 15 children, more than any other U.S. president. 2 of his grandchildren were still alive in the 21st century. That's how late in life he had kids. He once gave each of his children a designated day of the week to speak at dinner. Monday child, Tuesday child, like a domestic poem recited in turns. He didn't trust mirrors. He believed they captured dreams. So at night, he covered them with velvet cloths. Every single one. His bedroom resembled a haunted stage set, draped in shadow and paranoia. He also believed sneezing while reading meant the book was cursed. If he sneezed mid-chapter, he'd slam it shut and never return. He held mock trials for his pets, full trials, with charges, witnesses, and verdicts. His canary-off key, as it was found guilty of disturbing the peace on more than one occasion. And furniture? Named. His writing desk was Governor Quill. His bed was the thinking theater. He talked to them, held arguments, apologies, even consulted them during stressful decisions. Tyler carved faces into fruit before eating them, said it gave them dignity. He sprinkled salt into his shoes for moral grounding. He believed that echoes were signs from the spirit world, and once spent an entire afternoon shouting into a canyon, waiting for divine clarity to bounce back. He refused to use silver knives, called them metallic liars. Only bone-handled ones, thank you. He believed grapes were a food for royalty and only ate them on Sundays. He trained one of his sons to speak in rhyme. For poetic discipline. The child's reports? Rhyming couplets. Tyler was delighted. He died as a citizen of the Confederacy, the only U.S. president buried under a foreign flag, a final divisive flourish on an already tangled life. And while Tyler's eccentricities might feel like folklore, they pale in comparison to what followed. Because next came a man who had surgery without anesthesia, kept a dream diary filled with divine warnings, and believed even his spoon had a destiny. Step quietly into the relentless, sleepless world of James K. Polk. James K. Polk. James K. Polk was not a man you invited to dinner. He wouldn't drink, he wouldn't dance, he wouldn't laugh, and he certainly wouldn't eat anything you cooked. He was, in every way, a man at war with indulgence. The 11th President of the United States treated his term like a siege. 4 years of relentless work, 0 vacations, and a deathbed arrival that came quicker than anyone expected. Let's begin at the beginning. Surgery. At age 17, Polk had urinary stones removed, without anesthesia, awake, conscious. 19th century surgery was a blend of brute force and blind faith, and Polk endured it without a scream. That was the mold he was cast from. Stoic, silent, slightly terrifying. He never drank alcohol, never gambled, never went to the theater. He banned dancing at his own inaugural ball making, it the only inaugural event in U.S. history with 0 dancing. Imagine the scene. Dignitaries, generals, diplomats in powdered finery, standing around like wallflowers at a Puritan prom. He worked obsessively, slept 4 to 5 hours a night, reviewed and edited every single report from every government department personally. He didn't delegate, he devoured paperwork. His staff was terrified. His wife, Sarah Polk, acted as his de facto chief of staff, and even she once described him as a machine. And yet, beneath the mechanical discipline was a mind teeming with strange beliefs. Polk kept a dream diary. He believed his dreams were messages, some divine, some prophetic, some warnings cloaked in symbols. He'd cancel meetings based on what he saw in sleep. One dream about rain led to a week-long policy delay. He also believed that flowers invited spirits. Depending on their color and scent, a bouquet could either bless a room or curse it. He banned unfamiliar flowers from the White House after a mysterious arrangement appeared during a cabinet meeting. He considered it an unsettling omen. He was terrified of being touched while asleep. Even his wife wasn't allowed to reach over. The idea of contact during unconsciousness unnerved him, as though it might allow something, not someone, to enter. He refused clocks in the bedroom, said time had no place in dreams. And then there was his spoon. Not just any spoon, the spoon. A simple utensil from his childhood. He carried it with him, polished it nightly, and used it for every dessert. He believed it anchored his soul. No one was allowed to clean it but him. He referred to newspapers as venom in ink. He called coffee a spiritual hazard and banned it from the White House. Instead, he drank herbal teas brewed from hand-picked leaves. He trained himself to blink less during confrontations to appear more dominant. And he kept a debate ring on his right hand, worn only during arguments, symbolic armor. Polk pledged to serve only 1 term, and he kept his word. He left office gaunt, gray, and utterly spent. He died just 103 days later. Officially, exhaustion, spiritually, maybe he'd used himself up. But while Polk burned out like a tightly coiled star, his successor was all mud, meat, and raw tobacco. A man who didn't vote until he ran for office, who snored loud enough to shake the White House, and who may have died from eating cherries and iced milk. Ready or nother comes Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor was a president who looked more like a barn hand than a statesman and acted the part too. He never voted in an election before the one he won. Not because of scandal or rebellion. He just didn't care to. Politics wasn't his natural habitat. Mud was. Nicknamed Old Rough and Ready, Taylor wore farmer's clothes even as a general. He'd attend formal events looking like he'd just fixed a fence post with his bare hands, and sometimes he had. His boots? Caked in dirt, year-round. His reasoning? God put mud here for a reason. That's not metaphor. That's just policy. He often slept outdoors, even while indoors. On a wooden cot by choice. Even in the White House. He preferred hard surfaces, open windows, and the sound of crickets to pillows and presidential comfort. He believed dirt was a natural shield against disease, Bathing was rare. So was brushing his hair, which he tied back with twine on bad days. Taylor hated formality. Formal dinners annoyed him. He'd leave mid-meal without explanation. Once, he fell asleep during his own victory parade. Another time, he challenged a journalist to a duel over an article questioning his hygiene. Spoiler, the duel didn't happen, but the threat? Very real. He chewed raw tobacco. Constantly. He spit into open fireplaces, regardless of who was present. Cabinet meetings, state visits, no exceptions. His hygiene habits, if you could call them that, were 90% superstition and 10% trail dust. He refused to wear socks during summer, calling them foot blankets for the weak. His wool trousers were so patched by the time he reached the White House that they were almost see-through. He wore the same battered boots for over a decade. Even trained one of his dogs to fetch them. Only his boots. Not sticks, not slippers. Just those boots. And then there was the food. Taylor loved boiled beef and pickles. Ate them for breakfast. Hated pepper. Banned it from White House meals. Called wine perfumed foolishness. Only drank water or whiskey. Once ate an entire bucket of cherries followed by iced milk. Hours later, he collapsed. Days later, he was dead. Theories still. Swirl cholera, gastroenteritis, poisoning but the official line? Cherry milk combo. Presidential death by fruit and dairy. He distrusted banks, hid savings in barn walls using nails, referred to formal coats as funeral fabric, called neckties, city nooses. He often ate with his fingers when no one was watching. He believed hiccups were signs of dishonesty and refused to answer questions unless they were repeated 3 times. Seriously, 3 times. He didn't trust shadows, thought they carried secrets, had them drawn very lightly in portraits. He avoided mirrors, refused to use umbrellas, and once described the telegraph as the devil's tap-tap. Taylor's presidency lasted just 16 months. When he died, rumors of poisoning prompted an actual exhumation over a century later. The result? Still inconclusive. But then again, maybe Taylor would have preferred it that way, wrapped in mystery, covered in mud, and forever unpolished. But if Taylor was the raw frontier of American leadership, his successor was a man obsessed with soaps, handkerchiefs, and the proper emotional tone of spoon collections. Next up is Millard Filillmore, the cleanest neat freak ever to install a lead-line bathtub in the White House. Millard Filillmore. Millard Filillmore was the kind of man who brought a bar of soap to meetings, not metaphorically, literally, in his coat pocket, just in case. He didn't trust public sanitation, spontaneous social contact, or shoes that tracked in dirt. As president, he answered his own door, refused a butler, preferred the quiet click of his own heels on the White House floors to the sound of unnecessary conversation. This is a man who installed the first bathtub in the White House. Lead-lined, wooden, built more like a small boat than a modern basin. He also brought in the first kitchen stove, replacing the open-fire setup like he was retooling the executive branch for precision cooking. Filillmore didn't just clean up government, he cleaned it. Full stop. His obsession with neatness was operatic. He kept multiple shoe brushes in every room, just in case anyone himself included tracked in filth. He trimmed candle wicks during dinner. Realigned bookshelves before guests arrived, measured them afterward to see if they had shifted in the night. Yes, that's a quote. He read the Webster's dictionary twice, for fun, called it the spine of logic. He hated chewing gum, despised ice cubes, called them frozen lies, wouldn't eat apples unless peeled counterclockwise. He measured his socks at right angles and stored them by weekday. His front door? Painted monthly to keep bad luck away. He never laughed out loud, not once. At best, a subtle nasal snort. Even humor had to be dignified. His handkerchiefs were embroidered with owl symbols of wisdom. He refused to shake hands if someone had uneven fingernails. Once stopped a parade because someone stepped on his shadow. He wrote fan letters to poets and expected replies within a week. He folded his socks like geometry homework, slept only in beds that didn't face north, thought thunderstorms were a good time to meditate on government, called clocks tyrants in circles, and kept only sundials in his study. He had a spoon collection, not for eating, for contemplation, called them souvenirs of silence, gave his books nicknames. Hector was his copy of Plutarch's Lives. His own pen name? A quiet citizen. He wrote essays no one asked for, about decorum, etiquette, the moral instability of Paisley patterns. Filillmore hated beards, wouldn't hire men with facial hair, wore cotton gloves indoors so he wouldn't have to touch doorknobs, claimed that nighttime wind carried old voices, and kept his windows shut after sunset. He once ate nothing but crackers and boiled carrots for a full month to test his willpower. And when he died, he caught a cold walking in the rain to avoid a political dinner he didn't want to attend. The kind of death that felt more like a moral stand than a medical error. But if Filillmore was the president of control and calculated silence, the next man was a ghost walking in daylight. A whisper of a president who named his shadow, feared mirrors at night, and gave speeches to trees. Let's follow the haunted footfalls of Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce didn't just walk through the presidency, floated. A man so haunted, so gloom-stricken, he made Edgar Allan Poe look like an optimist with a beach house. Pierce was beautiful, articulate, and catastrophically cursed. Imagine a president who turned away from light, avoided mirrors at night, and gave names to his shadows. That was the 14th president of the United States. Pierce suffered from severe claustrophobia. He refused to sleep with the door closed. Even in the White House, where guards stood outside, he needed the exit open just in case. His mirrors faced the wall at night. Every evening, servants would rotate them, not for vanity, for fear. He believed reflections could watch you sleep. He wore the same black suit almost every day of his presidency, not for consistency, for mourning. The man wore grief like a uniform. Before taking office, his last surviving son was killed in a train accident right in front of him. The boy was decapitated. Pierce never recovered. He never smiled in public again. His solace? Cemeteries. He took long, solitary walks among the gravestones, saying it calmed his nerves. He whispered to trees, gave them names, apologized before cutting them down, called rain the sky's sadness, and often stood in it, hatless, letting it soak him while others ran for cover. He once gave a speech while mildly drunk, tripped over a flag, and saluted a tree, not metaphorically, an actual tree. He avoided eye contact with foreign diplomats, rarely made eye contact at all. He feared that cheese caused nightmares and banned it from his meals. He trained a dog to sit beside him during long meetings and referred to it as my silent conscience. He believed odd numbers were cursed, wouldn't dine at tables with 5 or 7 people, preferred even-numbered hotel floors. Believed vegetables grown in moonlight were more truthful. He often reread the same 3 books every winter, Shakespeare, Plutarch, and a single anonymous mystery novel he kept in a locked drawer. He was obsessed with punctuality, not just for appearances, but for fate. He believed being late bent the fabric of destiny. He wore boots with personal mottos carved inside. No one else was allowed to see them. He once tried to give a eulogy but got distracted by a fly, lost his train of thought, and ended it with, "And that is all." Then he sat down. He hummed the same 6-note tune whenever anxious. His staff called it the funeral whistle. He hated fireworks, once dove under a table during a July 4th celebration. He skipped meals often, claiming, "Thinking burns calories." He called yawning a leak in the conscience, and left rooms when people did it. After his presidency, Pierce became so reclusive that he once pretended to be his own butler to avoid greeting a visitor. His life became a soft blur, drifting through empty hallways and silent woods. But where Pierce was the sorrowful phantom of the presidency, his successor was the complete opposite, a bachelor who bought whiskey to win debates, wrote letters in slanted diagonals, and kept a hermit crab as a pet. Ready yourself for the deeply strange and almost cartoonish loneliness of James Buchanan. James Buchanan. James Buchanan was the only U.S. president who never married, and, for a man who loved order, routine, and emotional distance, that might have been exactly how he liked it. Nicknamed Old Buck, he was a lifelong bachelor surrounded by whispered rumors, rigid manners, and some of the most delightfully bizarre habits ever to grace the Oval Office. Let's start with the glass eye. Not in his face, in a jar on his desk. He used it to scare away children who tried to sneak into his office. Just one glassy orb, sitting in formaldehyde, staring out like a tiny sentry of silent judgment. That's not folklore. That's Tuesday for James Buchanan. He shared a home with Senator William Rufus King for over a decade. The pair were referred to sometimes derisively as Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy by Washington elites. Buchanan never publicly addressed the speculation. Instead, he focused on what mattered, precisely slanted letters written corner to corner across a page like a calligraphy battle drill. He had a hermit crab named Hermes. It lived in a small dish in his study, accompanied by a sign that read, "Quiet Strength." He never explained it. His daily routines were so fixed they bordered on ritual. Breakfast at exactly 6:45 a.m., not 6:44, not 6:46. Soup was always served at room temperature. He called hot soup chaos in a bowl. Laughter in the White House? Discouraged. He believed it should only occur in private. He'd glare at aides who chuckled too loud, then go back to reading papers, sometimes upside down, just for a challenge. He didn't trust belts, only custom trousers with button tabs. He wore wool socks year-round and claimed they whispered logic to his legs. He banned pies from state dinners, called them sweet tombs of chaos. He collected rocks, shaped like hearts, claimed they held the loneliness better. Buchanan kept a notebook of every pen he broke and the exact letter he was writing when it happened. If a pen snapped mid-sentence, he'd stop and rewrite the letter from scratch. Because the ink, he claimed, had been compromised. He once spent an entire cabinet meeting cutting apples into geometric shapes. Nobody stopped him. It was safer not to. He didn't read newspapers, called them ink clouds of hysteria. Instead, he had staff summarize them aloud, but only in a monotone. He wore a top hat indoors. Always, even during meals. Claimed it helped focus his upward thoughts. He believed sneezes cleared lies from the room. If someone sneezed during a meeting, he'd pause, reconsider everything they'd just said, possibly demote them. He referred to the Constitution as "my iron bride," called the White House the marble mausoleum in winter, sent birthday cards to foreign dignitaries written in Latin, and kept a secret staircase installed to avoid being intercepted by gossip. The man didn't just avoid scandally built architecture around it. He died alone, believing sincerely that history would vindicate him. It didn't. But his strangeness, his rituals, his silence, they've earned him a place in the pantheon of presidents who weren't just leaders, but walking, mumbling, ritualized mysteries. And speaking of mysteries, the next president wore his grief like a shadow, stored state secrets in his hat, and once dreamed about his own death days before it happened. Step into the somber, spectral, and poetically doomed world of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a legend before he became a martyr, a myth even as he lived. The tallest president at 6'4", he loomed over everyone physically, politically, and emotionally. But behind the stovepipe hat and Gettysburg gravity was a man haunted by melancholy, riddled with dark humor, and full of strange, spectral habits that made him feel more like a character from a Gothic novel than a politician. Let's start with that hat. It wasn't just for height. Lincoln used it like a filing cabinet. Literally. He stored important documents in the lining notes, drafts, even speeches. He'd pull out a folded parchment mid-walk like a magician retrieving a dove. The Emancipation Proclamation may have been conceived in his mind, but parts of it rode around in his headgear. He didn't carry money, ever. He'd borrow change from staff when he needed it, often for something mundane, like an apple. He wrote poetry and secretabsessed with themes of death, graves, and vanished time. When he wasn't president, he was a circuit lawyer who practiced courtroom manipulation by storytelling. He didn't argue and mesmerized. He'd spin a tale so disarming, so absurd, that juries nodded before realizing what had just happened. He had a high-pitched nasal voice, surprising for a man of his stature. He rarely raised it, believed quiet authority carried more weight than thunder. And yet, he would break tension with funeral jokes. Not just dark humor, funeral humor. He once told a joke during a literal funeral procession, saying he hoped no one in the casket took offense. He had recurring dreams about his own death. One especially chilling dream showed him walking through the White House, hearing sobs, only to find a corpse in the East Room. "Who is dead?" he asked. "The president," said a soldier. Days later, he was assassinated. He believed in omens. Thunderstorms made him nervous. He hated being touched, rarely hugged, even friends. He chewed tree bark and apple cores when deep in thought. Slept with one leg dangling off the bed, claimed it helped circulation. Refused to use gloves unless absolutely necessary, and when he did, they were always too small. He loved cats. Let them eat from the table during meals. His pet turkey, Jack, was spared from being the White House Thanksgiving dinner after Lincoln personally pardoned him. Yes, that's where the turkey pardon tradition began. He hated dentists. Once pulled his own tooth with pliers. He also believed his left-handedness, though mostly ambidextrous, gave him secret wisdom. He kept a compass and knife in his pocket at all times. Never formally joined a church, but read the Bible every morning. Believed deeply in providence, God's will, in government, in war, in his own life. He told jokes during cabinet crises, blinked in nearly every photograph he hated being still, once read a newspaper upside down just to challenge his mind. And yet, when war loomed, he read Macbeth. Memorized entire Shakespeare passages. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow rolled off his tongue like prophecy. He kept a lock of his dead son Willie's hair in his wallet. Walked the streets of D.C. alone at night, thinking out loud. Wrestled political rivals literally, and often won. He wrote love letters under pseudonyms, slipping them into public library books for unsuspecting readers to find. And then, on the 14th of April, 1865, he sat in Ford's Theater and was shot from behind. His dream had come true. His myth was complete. But while Lincoln's story ends in tragedy, the next chapter opens with a tailor who sewed his own suits, trusted no banks, and hung old iron tools in the Oval Office like they still had something to say. Meet the stubborn, steel-threaded soul of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson came into the presidency not by vote, but by bullet. Lincoln was assassinated, and suddenly, the tailor from Tennessee who once couldn't read or write was leader of a bleeding, broken nation. And if Lincoln was marble carved into myth, Johnson was iron hammered into anger. Everything about him felt clenched, his fists, his jaw, his worldview, a man of stitching and spitting, patched together with grudges. He was the only president to have been a tailor by trade. He made his own clothes, sewed his own suits, repaired his own coats while in office. In fact, he kept a sewing kit in his desk drawer right beside state documents and sometimes whiskey, because Johnson believed every man should be able to fix what was broken with his own hands. That included clothes. That included the union. He hated banks, never trusted them, hid money in the floorboards of his home. He also distrusted paper currency and insisted on being paid in gold coin for years. He would bite coins to check the honesty. Even as president, he refused to use the presidential carriage, called it a rolling lie, preferred walking, or, if necessary, a borrowed mule. He once walked to a state dinner, boots caked in mud, dust on his coat, arriving like he'd just stepped off a battlefield, which, in his mind, he probably had. He gave long, rambling speeches often, with no clear point delivered in a raw, emotional tone that veered from logic into folklore. He believed public emotion was a tool more powerful than law. This might be why he gave one of the worst inaugural speeches in history, while sick and possibly drunk, slurring words, repeating himself, shouting at no one in particular. He kept iron tools in the White House old blacksmithing equipment and tailor's shears, not for decoration, for memory, for grounding. He believed those tools still had labor in them. He talked to them sometimes, during late-night pacing. Asked them what they'd make of the country now. He chewed tobacco constantly, spat into a brass spittoon with pinpoint accuracy even while arguing. He had a temper that was practically seismic. Once, he shouted so hard at a senator during a private meeting that the window cracked. He didn't like dogs, said they were liars and fur, but he adored goats. Kept one on the White House lawn, named it Democracy. When it escaped, he reportedly said, "Even democracy wants out." Johnson refused to wear gloves, said they made hands soft and words softer. He didn't trust telegraphs, called them wires of deceit. Once wrote an entire speech in pencil on the back of a quilt because paper was too clean for dirty truths. He was the first president to be impeached, survived by one vote. Afterward, he walked through the halls of the Capitol building in silence, nodding at portraits like they were old enemies. When he left office, he went back to Tennessee, ran for Senate, won, became the only former president to serve in the Senate, because the man just couldn't sit still. And while Andrew Johnson stitched himself into history through sheer stubborn grit, the man who followed him was as different as fire from steel, a general turned peacemaker, who smoked 20 cigars a day, wrote his memoirs while dying, and once arrested the Ku Klux Klan by executive order. Next comes the gravel-voiced ghostwriter of War and Reconciliation, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was a paradox wrapped in cigar smoke. A quiet man who commanded thunder on the battlefield. A general who hated war. A president who disliked politics. A legend who preferred silence. He looked like a man carved out of river mud, and Cannon Sudan carried himself like he was always halfway through writing a eulogy, even when he smiled. Grant smoked up to 20 cigars a day. That's not an exaggeration, that's math. He received thousands of them as gifts after the Civil War. Boxes upon boxes arrived at the White House. He didn't waste them. He just lit one with the ember of the last, like a living chain of nicotine meditation. Even during meetings, he'd tap ash into government reports and keep going like punctuation was a distraction. He didn't like blood. As a general, he refused to visit field hospitals. He never watched amputations. It wasn't squeamishness. It was horror, hidden behind stone. He loved horses more than most humans. Had a near psychic connection with them. Could calm a panicked stallion with just a whisper. Rode into battle like he was born in the saddle. Grant wore clothes like afterthoughts, often wrinkled, dusty, ill-fitting. Even as president, he dressed like a man headed to a quiet funeral for someone he didn't particularly like. His boots were never polished. His hats were always askew. His hair was its own ungoverned territory. He had a terrible voice, gravelly, slurred. He avoided speeches. When he did speak publicly, it was short, awkward, sometimes entirely read from a sheet of paper held upside down by accident more than once. His second inaugural address was delivered so quietly that many in the crowd thought he had finished before he'd even begun. He trusted people too much. It was his fatal flaw. He was surrounded by schemers and crooks who exploited his loyalty. When scandals erupted during his administration, he was often the last to know. When he did find out, he'd react with the slow disappointment of a teacher watching a favorite student cheat. He hated alcohol, or at least, hated its effect on his name. Grant had a reputation as a drunk, and while he did drink heavily in his younger years, as president he rarely touched a drop, but the rumors stuck. One general famously said, "Find out what he drinks and send it to the rest of the army." Grant didn't like being touched, avoided handshakes when possible, gave firm nods instead. Believed eye contact was the only honest introduction. He had a superstitious fear of thunderstorms. Believed they were echoes of the dying. Once spent an entire night sitting silently in the White House library, lights off, listening to thunder roll over the Potomac. After leaving office, he went broke. Betrayed by a business partner, he spent his final months dying of throat cancer and writing his memoirs in agony. Refused morphine for fear it would cloud his thoughts. He wrote until his hands bled. Finished the last chapter days before he died. The book became a bestseller, saving his family from poverty. His final battle won with ink. He was buried in what remains the largest mausoleum in North America. A tomb for a man who never chased glory, never boasted, never shouted. A general who hated war. A president who trusted too much. A man who left smoke trails across history. And now, prepare for the strangest mustache to ever hold high office, a man who banned alcohol but threw wild parties, who wrote romance novels under a pseudonym and may have had a pet opossum named Rebecca. Welcome to the complicated carnival of Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes looked like the ghost of Christmas policy reform, a man with the beard of a Civil War general and the soul of a librarian who might arrest you for dog-earing a page. But underneath the straight-laced posture and Presbyterian temperament was a man full of bizarre contradictions. He was dry on the surface, but strange things grew in that dryness. Start with the election. Hayes became president through what might be the sketchiest deal in U.S. political history, the compromise of 18-77. He lost the popular vote. The electoral votes were disputed, so backroom bargaining got him the job, and for the rest of his life, people called him his fraudulency. Not that Hayes ever acknowledged it. He simply nodded and got back to reorganizing the White House furniture. Literally. He rearranged the Oval Office constantly, believed furniture had moods, and needed proper alignment with natural light. He once moved a desk 8 times in 1 week, claimed it improved thought clarity. He also believed potted plants responded to human speech and would whisper encouragement to them before meetings. Hayes banned alcohol from the White House, but threw wildly extravagant parties anyway. The guests drank lemonade and rolled their eyes. The press mocked it as the lemonade administration, but he didn't care. He believed in moral example, and yet he kept a pet opossum, possibly named Rebecca, possibly named Satan. Records are unclear. He wrote in his diary obsessively, every single day, tiny, exact script, weather, mood, thoughts, gossipy notes on staff behavior. Once, he wrote 10 pages about the shape of a cloud he saw during breakfast. Another time, he logged every cough and sneeze from a dinner party and tried to determine who was getting sick first. He loved romance novels, secretly wrote one under a pseudonym as a teenager. Believed fiction helped soften the male impulse. No one's ever found the manuscript, but Hayes scholars believe it included a love triangle, a duel, and a very intense orchard scene. He wore only wool, even in summer, claimed cotton was a dishonest fabric. He ironed his own cravats, used 3 separate brushes for his beardone for shaping, one for shine, one for prayer days. Would not eat corn on the cob in public, said it was a display of teeth unbecoming of civilization. He believed mirrors should never face a bed, ever. He also believed Monday decisions were cursed and often delayed appointments until Tuesday. He thought birds understood death and avoided areas with too many crows, kept a small bell on his desk that he rang before signing any law to alert the universe. His handwriting was so precise it resembled a machine. He measured margins with a ruler. He once wrote a 14-page letter to a publisher explaining why ellipses were lazy punctuation. He slept only on his right side, ate lunch in exactly 12 bites, timed his chewing. After his presidency, he became obsessed with prison reform and educational access. But when not doing that, he would wander his estate at dusk, talking to owls. He called them keepers of dusk, wore gloves to touch newspapers, called coffee panic juice, once taught a dog to nod during lectures. When he died, his last words were, "I know I'm going where Lucy is." A rare burst of sentiment from a man who spent his life composing silence into ritual. And now, silence breaks. Because coming next is a man who ate everything, fought everyone, and once got stuck, literally stuck in the White House bathtub. Buckle up for the glorious, girthy eccentricity of James A. Garfield. James A. Garfield. James A. Garfield was a professor, preacher, general, and president, but also a man who ate more eggs than was probably safe, and once wrote with both hands at the same time in different languages. His brain was a supercomputer wrapped in sideburns, a trivia champion's fever dream. He knew Greek, Latin, calculus, and political theory, and somehow made room for massive breakfasts and low-key mystical habits in between. Let's start with the ambidexterity. Garfield could write in Greek with one hand and Latin with the other simultaneously. Not just for party tricks, though it certainly qualified. He believed it exercised the brain and created bilateral balance. People would watch, stunned, as 2 scripts unfolded across a single sheet of paper like mirrored incantations. He called it manual harmony. His memory was nearly photographic. He once recited an entire speech backwards. On a dare. For fun. He'd correct misquotes in real time. Interrupt a senator to say, "Actually, that was page 213, not 212. He was a professor at 26, a Civil War general at 30, a congressman at 32. By the time he was president, he'd already lived 3 careers. And he was hungry. Garfield ate like a man training for an Olympic eating competition. He consumed 6 eggs for breakfast minimum, with ham and corn cakes and molasses, then washed it down with black coffee and pickles. Pickles. At breakfast. Not as assiduous as a beverage chaser. He said it sharpened the senses. He slept in short bursts, claimed dreams, tangled the soul, took mind walks, instead napping for 20 minutes, waking, reading philosophy, then dozing again. He believed rest should never be full, only measured. And when not sleeping or eating or conjugating verbs in Sanskrit, Garfield collected rocks, hundreds of them. Labeled, organized, occasionally kissed for luck. He was fascinated by telepathy, had long discussions about it. Once claimed to feel his son's sadness from across the country. No telegram. Just a chill on the spine. He also believed the human spine stored memory, would occasionally press ice against the back of his neck to clear thoughts. He read upside down, sideways, backward often on purpose. He said it forced the words to earn their meaning. He once gave a 90-minute speech entirely without notes, quoting Shakespeare, Euclid, and the U.S. Constitution, while pacing barefoot on a velvet rug. Yes, barefoot. Said it connected him to the static of the world, He had no intention of being president, literally stumbled into the nomination, gave a speech to endorse someone else, and walked out as the chosen one. "I am stunned," he reportedly said, but accepted the job anyway, like a man being handed a very large, very strange hat. And then, 199 days later, he was shot. Not immediately fatal. He lingered. Weeks of infection, agony, medical missteps. Doctors poked at his wound with unsterilized fingers. The bullet wasn't what killed him, they were. Alexander Graham Bell tried to locate the bullet with a metal detector. It failed, because the bed had metal springs. He died in the 18th of September, -81. But his legacy? A genius of rare absurdity. A breakfast-devouring, bilingual, side-burned anomaly. And from a mind like a pinball machine comes a body that simply couldn't fit into a regular bathtub. Next up, a man so massive, so methodical, so fond of naps and steak, he became an accidental legend. Enter the deeply seated and frequently wedged William Howard Taft. Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur didn't look like a president. He looked like a Victorian opera villain. Massive mutton chops, tailored suits that glistened like oil, and a watch chain thick enough to tow a carriage. But behind the polished exterior of America's 21st president was a man of fastidious habits, midnight obsessions, and fashion choices so precise they bordered on religious. Arthur owned over 80 pairs of trousers, each custom-fitted, each rotated seasonally like sacred relics. He changed outfits multiple times a day, not for function, but for vibe. His morning coat wasn't appropriate for a 2 p.m. tea. His 2 p.m. coat was a disgrace by 5. He measured social credibility in inches of lapel and ounces of pomade. He didn't just dress well, he dressed aggressively. One newspaper called him the gentleman president, and Arthur took it as a challenge. He personally approved White House floral arrangements, hated the way morning light hit certain wallpaper, and once rejected a rug for being morally loud. He redecorated the White House with the help of Louis Comfort Tiffany. The stained glass, the gaslight chandeliers, the jewel-tone velvet. It looked less like the people's house, and more like the set of an aristocratic seance. He auctioned off old White House furniture before moving in. Some pieces may have belonged to John Adams. He didn't care. They were ugly. He had a fear of drafts, kept the windows sealed so tight in winter that guests routinely fainted from the heat. He wore furs inside, even while working. When asked about the temperature, he replied, "Warmth is the guardian of intellect." Arthur hated mornings, refused to schedule anything before 11 a.m. He stayed up late, prowling the White House like a velvet-cloaked phantom, often writing letters at 2 a.m., sipping wine and reorganizing cufflinks. He hosted the best parties in Washington, dinners that stretched until dawn, champagne served with oysters, candlelight flickering off polished shoes. But despite the opulence, Arthur was intensely private. He burned all his personal papers before he died. Diaries, letters, notes, erased his trail like a ghost ashamed of its footprints. He left behind only a wardrobe and the vague smell of cologne in the national memory. He was obsessed with punctuality, but not for meetings, only for lunch. He believed digestive timing was the key to energy alignment. Ate at exactly 12:45 p.m., even during national emergencies. Once made a general wait while he finished a fruit compote. Declared afterward, "Crisis is no excuse for chaos." He rarely gave speeches. Not because he couldn't, because he wouldn't. He believed words lost power the more they were used. Instead, he communicated through glances, tailored pauses, and monocle tilts. He once said more with a raised eyebrow than some men say in Congress. And despite being born into machine politics, Arthur shocked everyone by rising above it. He became somehow a reformer, quietly cleaned up corruption, refused to appoint unqualified friends. He looked like a Gilded Age caricaturan and behaved like a statesman. When he died, It was quietly, from a kidney disease he kept secret. He told almost no one, faded into history with his usual style, silent, sharp, mysterious. And next comes the man who hated electricity, refused to touch light switches, and once kept a cow on White House grounds to ensure a fresh milk supply. Welcome to the stubborn simplicity and hidden strangeness of Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, and somehow, that's not the weirdest thing about him. The man was a walking contradiction, a constitutional purist with a love of beer, a workaholic who napped daily, a political heavyweight who once kept a live cow on White House grounds. Her name was Bossy. She had free range of the lawn because, according to Cleveland, store milk can't be trusted. He didn't like change, technological or otherwise. He distrusted electricity so much that he refused to touch the White House light switches, wouldn't even enter a room alone after dark. He made staff flip the switches for him and once reportedly ate dinner by candlelight, sitting in the glow of modern fixtures he'd ordered left off. He weighed over 250 pounds. Towering and slow-moving, he was known to fall asleep mid-conversation. But don't mistake the naps for laziness. Cleveland was famously industrious. He reviewed every bill himself, stayed late, read legal briefs for fun, and issued a staggering number of vetoes, over 300 in his first term alone. No president had vetoed more, ever. His pen was his sword. He didn't trust banks, kept his savings in cash, wrapped in paper, stored in desk drawers. Believed banks were a polite version of robbery. Once paid a debt with a burlap sack of silver coins. Cleveland had a secret surgery, a big one. In 1893, during his second term, doctors removed a cancerous tumor from the roof of his mouth. The surgery took place on a yacht to avoid public panic. His jawbone was partially removed and replaced with a rubber prosthetic. The press didn't find out for years. He gave speeches afterward with a fake upper palate and nobody knew. He married Frances Folsom, who was 27 years younger than him. She had been his ward since childhood after her father, a close friend, passed away. He watched her grow up, then married her when she turned 21. America blinked awkwardly and moved on. He hated formal dinners. Once served sardines and crackers at a White House banquet, then dismissed the guests early so he could get back to thinking. He called social small talk the enemy of logic, refused to shake hands during cold season, slept with a fan blowing directly on his feet, believed it pulled illness downward and out. Cleveland loved fishing more than politics. Once took a 3-day vacation in the middle of a legislative crisis. Said he was communing with silence. He nicknamed his favorite fishing rod Vito, claimed he thought better with it in hand. He kept a journal full of questions he never answered. Entries like, "What is justice?" or "Is sugar moral?" scattered among notes about train schedules and bacon orders. Despite his size, he moved quietly. Staff often didn't hear him enter a room. He'd just appear, like a bear in a suit. Silent, brooding, occasionally clearing his throat like thunder, warning you it was time to behave. Grover Cleveland died in 1908. His last words? "I have tried so hard to do right." A simple sentence from a complicated man. Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison was the human embodiment of a snowdrift cold on the surface, quietly intricate underneath, and occasionally, if you paid close attention, sparkling with weirdness. Standing barely 5'6" with a voice so soft it was practically mist, he was often mistaken for a clerk. Once, at a White House reception, someone handed him their coat, assuming he was a doorman. He took it, handed it off, said nothing. He was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the president who died after 31 days in office. Benjamin outlived that milestone easily, but inherited more than just the name. He inherited the curse of being remembered vaguely. Yet peel back the frost. and you'll find a president who electrified the White House, literally, recited Bible verses in his sleep, and kept a goat named Old Whiskers that pulled his grandchildren around in a cart on the lawn. Harrison was the first president to have electricity in the White House, but he wouldn't touch the switches. Like his predecessor Cleveland, he feared being electrocuted. He and his wife would often sleep with the lights on because neither wanted to risk flipping them off. Imagine walking through the executive mansion at 2 a.m., every lamp ablaze, while the commander-in-chief tiptoes like a vampire in a tuxedo. He had a beard so thick and meticulous that it inspired fan mail. People wrote to ask how he maintained it. He once joked that, "God gave me this whisker forest to hide expressions I'd rather not show." That wasn't modesty, it was policy. Harrison's default emotion was mild suspicion. His speeches were precise, bone, dry, and so densely written that newspapers had to paraphrase them just to prevent public confusion, induced yawns. He recited Bible verses accurately in his sleep, not just once, often. Staff reported hearing long passages from Leviticus or Proverbs drifting through the walls of the White House bedroom like an Old Testament ghost was dictating policy. He claimed it kept the mind clean. He believed memory was a divine filing system and used hymns to defragment it. He was obsessed with punctuation. Personally, edited public documents with a fountain pen dipped in green ink so the changes looked gentle, not angry. He rewrote speeches days before delivery. His notes? So heavily corrected they looked like ancient battle maps. He believed exclamation marks were for the weak-willed. Harrison didn't enjoy crowds, refused to campaign for himself in the traditional sense. Instead, he gave speeches from his front porch while thousands gathered on his lawn. This front porch campaign became iconic. He'd just stand there, nodding, hands behind his back, looking like the ghost of constitutional restraint. He kept a pet opossum, also named Mr. Reciprocity, to match his favorite trade policy. No joke, the opossum made public appearances. The trade policy, meanwhile, made his re-election chances vanish. He loved weather patterns, took barometric readings daily, kept logs of wind direction, called fog God's indecision. Once refused to make a major decision during a thunderstorm, believed the static interfered with moral clarity. He wore 3 layers year-round, said sweat was a reminder of mortality, owned over 40 pairs of gloves, labeled them, rotated them, called one pair the Sabbath set. After losing re-election to Grover Cleveland, Harrison faded back into silence, lecturing on law and muttering psalms in train cars. He died in 1901. His last days were spent cataloging family silverware by emotional value. William McKinley was a man of silk handkerchiefs, quiet glances, and obsessive politeness, the presidential equivalent of a pressed linen napkin. He was dignified, devout, and endlessly gentle. But behind the perfectly parted hair and carefully measured speeches lived a deeply strange, habit-bound man who carried a red carnation everywhere he went, every day, without fail, until the day he didn't, and that's the day he died. Let's start with the carnation. It wasn't fashion, it was a superstition. McKinley believed it brought him luck. He pinned one to his lapel every morning, handed them out to visitors like talismans. His personal greenhouse grew them year-round, and on the 6th of September, 1901, during a reception at the Pan American Exposition, he gave away his last one to a little girl in line. Seconds later, he was shot. Yes, he was assassinated during a handshake. And in classic McKinley fashion, as he collapsed, his first words were, "Don't let them hurt him," referring to the assassin, manners unto death. McKinley was methodical to the point of ritual. He woke at the same hour, read the Bible for exactly 20 minutes, then consumed a breakfast of toast, hot milk, and precisely 1 soft-boiled egg. Every day, for years. His suits were so well fitted, he was once accused of sleeping in them. He never confirmed or denied it. He didn't trust telephones, wouldn't speak into one unless absolutely necessary. Said voices didn't travel properly over wires. He preferred face-to-face talks or handwritten letters, which he composed in looping cursive on custom-embossed stationery. Even his grocery lists were calligraphic masterpieces. He was obsessed with handkerchiefs, carried up to 5 at a time, folded them into geometric shapes, gave them names like the summer one or Thursday's wing. If he dropped one, he'd rather walk away than pick it up in public. Said it was undignified. He loved his wife, Ida, with an intensity bordering on obsession. She suffered from severe epilepsy. During state dinners, if she had a seizure, McKinley would gently cover her with a napkin and continue the conversation like nothing happened, then care for her the moment guests departed. He adjusted his entire schedule to align with her needs. Once canceled a national tour because she had a headache. He kept a private drawer of sugar cubes, not for tea, for stress. He'd pop one during tense meetings, like a child sneaking candy before bed. He believed it tempered aggression. Also kept a silver coin he flipped in moments of indecision. Heads for war, tails for diplomacy. Metaphorically, we hope. He was so reserved that staff referred to him as the Whisper. His voice rarely rose, even during war briefings. He believed shouting was evidence of intellectual surrender. During the Spanish-American War, he read casualty reports in total silence, then sent handwritten condolence letters by the dozen. He loved mechanical clocks, owned dozens, wound them personally, believed they represented the divine order of progress, had one made to tick in the rhythm of his heartbeat. Yes, that happened. His assassination, like Lincoln's, came during what should have been a moment of peace. He survived for days after the shooting, rallying, joking with staff, whispering affection to his wife. But infection spread, surgery failed, and on the 14th of September, 19-01, William McKinley died with a prayer on his lips. His final words, "It is God's way, His will be done." And with that, the calm, clockwork world of McKinley vanished, replaced instantly by the charging bull of progress. Because next came a president who boxed diplomats, rode moose for photos, and had a voice that could shatter glass and ignite revolutions. Get ready. Theodore Roosevelt is next. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt didn't enter the presidency, exploded into it. He was a fistful of dynamite stuffed into a Rough Rider's uniform, a man who boxed in the White House, gave campaign speeches with a bullet lodged in his chest, and once declared that the presidency was a bully pulpit, as in a platform for shouting things at the top of your lungs until reality got in line. Let's start with the moose. Yes, the moose. Roosevelt once posed for a photo while riding one across a river, because simply sitting on a horse like a normal politician wasn't intense enough. The image became iconic. Whether it was real or early political Photoshop doesn't matter. The point was clear. This man would wrestle nature into submission for a good picture. He boxed in the White House basement with real opponents, often younger, stronger men. One match left him blind in one eye. He didn't stop, just switched sports, took up jiu-jitsu. At age 50, he spoke in exclamation points, constantly. "Delighted" was a favorite phrase. He wrote letters that read like motivational manifestos, would sign off personal notes with things like, "Strive mightily," or "Hit hard and ride fast." He had asthma as a child, weak, sickly, barely able to breathe. So he built his body into a fortress through sheer willpower, lifted weights, climbed mountains, fought anything that looked vaguely like adversity. He once said, "I never took the position that I must not fail, but that I must do all I could to succeed." His daily routine was a cyclone of activity. He read one book a day, sometimes more. wrote 150,000 letters in his lifetime, hunted lions in Africa, explored rivers in South America, gave speeches in remote towns where the nearest audience was half wolves. He believed boredom was a moral failure. He kept a menagerie of pets in the White House, a macaw that cursed in Spanish, a badger named Josiah, a one-legged rooster, a hyena, a garter snake named Emily Spinach, and a pony that rode the elevator up to visit his son in bed. Yes, the White House had a pony elevator moment. He was shot during a campaign speech in Milwaukee. The bullet passed through his overcoat, folded speech, and eyeglass case, then lodged in his chest. He refused to go to the hospital. Instead, he stood before the crowd, opened his coat to show the blood, and shouted, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Then he talked for 90 minutes. He called his children the greatest show on earth. Let them stage full-blown theatrical productions in the East Room. One son once roller-skated through the state dining room wearing a raccoon mask. Roosevelt just laughed. He believed coffee was best when it could stand a spoon upright. He often drank a gallon a day. Yes, a gallon. His hands constantly trembled. His voice never did. He wrote his own epitaph before he died. He kept the government open, the animals fed, and his enemies on edge. When he finally died, his son sent a telegram. "The old lion is dead. He had passed in his sleep, peacefully. For once, William Howard Taft." William Howard Taft didn't walk into the presidency, waddled in with a sigh. At over 300 pounds, he was the largest president in U.S. history, and possibly the most reluctant. Taft didn't want the job. His wife did. Teddy Roosevelt did. The entire Republican Party did. But Taft just wanted to be a judge. His dream wasn't power, it was precedent. Let's get it out of the way. Yes, the bathtub story is mostly true. After getting stuck in a White House tub, Taft had an extra-wide one installed 7 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, with 4 men who helped him in and out. He joked about it later. Said, "I brought the presidency some weight," and he meant it both ways. But Taft was more than his girth. He was a nap-taking, trust-busting, mustache-massaging paradox. His mustache? Legendary. Groomed daily with a silver comb. It had the majestic curve of a Roman aqueduct and the determination of a courtroom drama. His staff said he'd stroke it when nervous, sometimes mid-meeting, sometimes mid-nap. Taft adored naps, took them every afternoon, sometimes during meetings. He once fell asleep at the opera, snored during the second act, and blamed the overture for sounding like a lullaby. He also installed the first Oval Office sleeping couch. Priorities. He hated confrontation. Unlike Roosevelt, who roared, Taft whispered. Instead of steamrolling enemies, he wrote them polite letters, drafted, edited, redrafted. He hated public speaking. Once gave a speech with his notes in the wrong order and just stopped, smiled, said, "That'll do," and walked off stage. Food was his comfort zone. Taft didn't just eat curated meals. He had a soft spot for steak, lobster salad, and turtle soup. Yes, turtle soup, served hot, with crackers, every Friday. He believed in digestive discipline, meaning he ate the same portions every day, at the same time, and still ballooned like a weather balloon in a 3-piece suit. He didn't walk fast. He shuffled. Slowly. Deliberately. Staff would position chairs along his routes in case he needed to pause. He once got winded climbing 3 steps, sat down, and launched into a 20-minute speech on judicial independence. The man's stamina was 90% opinion, 10% oxygen. Taft installed a milk cow on the White House lawn, Pauline Wayne, who delivered fresh dairy daily. He called her First Cow, wrote affectionate notes about her in his personal diary, gave her a ribbon, and had her picture taken for press releases. He hated the phone, claimed voices on it sounded like ants arguing in a tin. preferred handwritten notes. His penmanship looked like legal script, carved in buttersoft, sloping, oddly soothing. And when he finally left the presidency, he rejoiced. Literally half skipped down the Capitol steps and told reporters, "I'm glad to be out of it." Years later, he achieved his lifelong dream, appointed Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He was the only person to ever lead both the executive and judicial branches, and he liked the second one much more. He lost weight before he died. Nearly 80 pounds, grew quieter, calmer, still took naps, still stroked that mustache. And when he passed, the nation needed a special casket extra-wide, pallbearers upgraded from 6 to 8, because even in death, Taft remained larger than life. And while Taft brought the weight, the man who followed him brought the war. Next comes a scholar-turned-warlord, a professor-turned-prophet, who once ran the country like it was a graduate seminar on divine destiny. Brace for the conflicted conscience and cerebral combustion of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a president who spoke like a prophet and governed like a professor, nervously clutching a syllabus in a hurricane. He was cerebral, severe, a Seneca man who believed history was a text to be annotated in red ink, and the presidency was a lecture podium raised high above the noisy, irrational mob. But behind the pince-nez glasses and Presbyterian steel was a mind haunted by dreams, migraines, and the absolute conviction that he was right always. Wilson began each day not with coffee, but with silence. A full hour of it. He'd sit alone in a darkened study, hands folded, breathing like a metronome. He claimed this centered the soul. He also believed certain days of the week had moral vibrations. Tuesday, for example, was for treaties. Thursday, never for speeches. Friday, a day for internal conflict, he once said cryptically to a baffled aide. He walked with the posture of a stern librarian, but his brain moved like a hummingbird on espresso. He read ancient Greek for fun, quoted Dante in meetings. Once tried to settle a policy dispute by reciting passages from Paradise Lost. His cabinet stared blankly. Wilson sighed. "We must elevate the discourse," he muttered. He didn't like jokes, or laughter, or music that didn't involve organs. He once left a dinner party because someone played a ragtime tune on the piano. Said it unraveled the national fabric. He enjoyed solemn marches, silent reading, and the sound of ink scratching paper. Wilson was a chronic sufferer of migraines, blinding, ice-pick to the skull migraines. During one attack, he had to be led out of a public event by 2 aides, eyes closed, whispering scripture. He also suffered from mysterious nervous breakdowns throughout his life periods of total emotional collapse that he kept hidden under layers of dignity and academic jargon. He believed in destiny, not hope, not luck. Destiny. He once told his wife, "God ordained me for this work." And when the world erupted into war, he saw his role not just as leader but redeemer. He wrote the 14 points like commandments, spoke of peace in terms usually reserved for saints and saviors. He had dreams, vivid ones, prophetic ones. He claimed to dream about people before meeting them, kept a dream journal, annotated it, color-coded his entries. Once canceled a diplomatic meeting after dreaming of a red storm cloud entering his study. "The air is not yet right," he told his secretary. He hated physical weakness, yet was ravaged by strokes. In 1919, after a grueling campaign to get the League of Nations approved, Wilson collapsed, silently, horrifyingly. A stroke paralyzed the left side of his body and crippled his ability to govern, and yet he stayed in office. His wife, Edith, essentially ran the country. For nearly a year, the U.S. operated under what historians now call the petticoat presidency. He never admitted the extent of his condition, never resigned. He communicated in cryptic phrases, scrawled in trembling handwriting. His isolation was total, a president in shadow, a mind breaking beneath the weight of its own divine expectations. When he died in 1924, he still believed the world had failed him, not the other way around. And now, from solemn shadows to bright lights, from dream journals to roaring headlines, get ready for the most telegenic, tap-dancing, radio-loving president of the jazz age. Next up, Warren G. Harding, the man with the voice of a god, the luck of a gambler, and a cabinet full of crooks. Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding was a man who looked like a president, sounded like a president, and probably should never have been president. He had the voice of a thunderous narrator, the jawline of a marble bust, and the moral compass of a racetrack. But underneath the slick suits, booming baritone, and soothing campaign promises, Harding was a walking contradiction. Gentle yet chaotic, charming yet baffled, president by accident, scandal by design. Let's start with the voice. It was his superpower. Deep, resonant, warm as a fireplace, and just as hypnotic. People said listening to Harding speak was like being tucked into bed by history itself. He could read a grocery list and make it sound like scripture. That voice got him elected. Not policy, not passion. Just pure vocal gravity. Harding didn't want the job. Not really. He told friends he was unfit, that he lacked the mental gymnastics for high office. But the Republican Party saw his jawline, heard that voice, and said, perfect. He was nominated after 10 deadlocked ballots. The decision was made in a smoke-filled room, literally. The phrase, smoke-filled room, comes from Harding's nomination. Once elected, Harding's personal life turned into a tabloid opera. He drank during Prohibition, hosted poker games in the White House, lost the White House china in a bet. Seriously, gone. Replaced with whatever he could scrape together. He'd slip out of the Oval Office for secret booze runs and return smelling like bourbon and scandal. He called his wife the Duchess. She called him Warren, but probably wanted to call him a lot more. Their marriage was frosty. Harding had multiple affairs. One of them, with a woman named Nan Britton, allegedly took place in a White House closet. They had a child. Nan later wrote a tell-all, titled The President's Daughter. It was juicy. Congress wanted it banned. Harding, conveniently, was already dead. He referred to his genitals as Jerry in love letters. And yes, those letters survived. One begins with, Jerry, you are a sight this morning. Let that haunt your civic imagination forever. Harding loved animals. Had a dog named Laddie Boy who got more press than some cabinet members. Threw birthday parties for him, even had a custom chair at cabinet meetings. Laddie Boy didn't bite anyone. People bit each other, metaphorically, behind Harding's back. His cabinet was a swamp of corruption. The Teapot Dome scandal, bribery, fraud, the works. He claimed to know nothing. Most believe him. He was charming, yes, also asleep at the wheel. He once referred to the presidency as a hell of a job. Said he was not fit for this office and never should have been here. He wasn't joking. He skipped briefings. Delegated until there was nothing left to do but smoke, smile, and hope. He died suddenly in 1923 on a cross-country voyage of understanding. Collapsed in a hotel room in San Francisco. Some say stroke, some whisper heart attack. Others speculate more salacious causes. The truth? Harding died the same way he governed, mid-sentence, mid-charm, mid-chaos. His tomb looks like a Greek temple, massive, ornate, oversized, just like the myth that grew around him. And from the charming disaster of Harding, we fall into the dry, silent shuffle of the next man. A president who said almost nothing, did almost nothing, and somehow, in his silence, made history. Next up, the ghost of frugality, the apostle of austerity, Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge didn't speak unless he had to, which is how he got the nickname Silent Cal, a moniker he wore like a bulletproof vest made of quiet. He didn't charm, he didn't joke, he didn't fill space with filler. He stared at the room, and the room blinked first. Coolidge was the anti-Harding. After the chaos of poker nights and scandals, Coolidge entered the White House like a hush entering a cathedral. He barely raised his voice above a murmur. Once, at a dinner party, a woman told him she'd bet she could get him to say more than 2 words. Coolidge's reply, "You lose." He would sit in total silence for hours, in meetings, at dinners, on train rides. When asked what he was thinking, he'd sometimes respond, "Nothing in particular," not evasively, genuinely. Silence was his fortress, his power move. He was once found sitting in his underwear, wearing a top hat, feeding squirrels on the White House lawn. No context. Just Coolidge, quietly communing with woodland creatures, dressed like a partially loaded formal telegram. He loved animals. Had a raccoon named Rebecca who roamed the White House freely. She had a collar, she had a schedule. Coolidge walked her on a leash like a prize poodle. When staff suggested she be served for Thanksgiving dinner, as was tradition in some parts of the country, Coolidge was horrified. "Rebecca is a pet," he said firmly, "not a meal." He also had a bobcat, a donkey, a goose, and a pygmy hippo named Billy, sent by the King of Abyssinia. Billy lived in the National Zoo. Coolidge visited him often. He slept 11 hours a day, napped every afternoon, believed sleep was nature's sedative. If awoken early, he would mutter and roll over like a grumpy ghost. He once said, "If you don't say anything, you won't be called on to repeat it." Coolidge hated telephones, made less than 24 calls as president, preferred writing in sharp, short bursts. His speeches, minimalist masterpieces. He'd strip out entire paragraphs just because they were too loud. He edited with scissors, literally cut speeches down with blades. He believed economy wasn't just fiscal, it was moral. Refused to waste time, words, or electricity. He had lights turned off in unused rooms, ate simple meals, kept receipts for everything. He once returned a gift because it seemed too generous. It was a tie. Despite this, he had an unexpected flair for fashion, loved dressing well. Suits were always immaculate, shoes polished to obsidian. His closet was arranged by day and season, but he rarely wore hats. Said they interrupted thinking. Coolidge was obsessed with cleanliness. Brushed his teeth 4 times a day, gargled with salt water. Once had all the rugs in the White House steam cleaned just because one guest sneezed. He believed germs were moral failures. He left office quietly, declined to run again. His farewell statement? "I do not choose to run for president in 19 to 28. That's it. No press tour, no memoirs. Just vanished into Vermont shadows." And when he died, he did it the Coolidge way, quietly, suddenly, in a chair, reading a book. No drama, just the end. From his ghostly stillness, we swing violently into the storm of the next president, a man whose name would become synonymous with catastrophe. A self-made mogul, part humanitarian, part national scapegoat. Next comes the engineer of silence, turned president of the crash, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the only president with a humanitarian halo and a national catastrophe strapped to his name. An engineer by trade, a philanthropist by instinct, and a bureaucratic savant by profession, Hoover was a man who believed deeply in order, logic, and the mathematical elegance of problem-solving. Unfortunately, the Great Depression was none of those things. And so Hoover became history's tragic misfire, the right brain in the wrong apocalypse. He spoke fluent Mandarin Chinese, learned it while living in China with his wife, Lu, during his time as a mining engineer. They used it at the White House so staff wouldn't understand their private conversations. Imagine walking into the Roosevelt room and hearing the President and First Lady whispering in perfect Mandarin about your tardiness. That happened. Hoover refused to let guests carry their own luggage, said it was an offense to American hospitality. Once took a suitcase from Winston Churchill. Churchill let him. Then asked if Hoover could carry his cigar case too. He had a passion for facts, kept a library of data charts, preferred numbers to people. Said of one meeting, the conversation was unsatisfactory, as no statistics were exchanged. His desk had more slide rules than family photos. His idea of relaxation? Rearranging files by year, category, and economic impact. Hoover was the first president born west of the Mississippi, grew up in a tiny Iowa cottage with no plumbing, orphaned by age 9, raised by Quakers, believed in simplicity. Lived with intense self-discipline, didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't gamble. When offered champagne, he'd say, "I prefer ideas to bubbles." He insisted on being served meals in silence. No waiters, just dumb waiters. Soundless trays sliding through hidden panels like presidential ghost food. He hated being watched while eating, said chewing was an undignified display of powerlessness. Hoover's presidential morning routine included a strange ritual: medicine ball therapy. He and his aides would toss a 6-pound ball around the south lawn in coordinated patterns at dawn. It was supposed to promote fitness and team building. Staff called it Hoover Ball. Most hated it. None dared quit. He never accepted a government salary, donated it all to charity. As Secretary of Commerce and President, said public service shouldn't be profit. During the Depression, he personally funded feeding programs and relief efforts, but insisted that the federal government should not. He believed charity should be private, not public. The philosophy would haunt him. When the stock market crashed in 1929, Hoover tried to fix it with commissions, conferences, and confidence. He believed the market would self-correct. He asked businesses not to cut wages, asked citizens to hold tight. The response? Breadlines, bank failures. Hooverville's makeshift shanty towns rose up, named in bitter irony after the man himself. He was intensely private, rarely smiled in public, rarely wept in private. Once described emotion as a deviation from reason. He wrote thousands of pages in retirement, defended his record until the end. Most Americans, however, remembered only the economic ruin. He died in 19 to 6,431 years after leaving office. By then, the New Deal, World War II, and multiple presidencies had buried his legacy under a landslide of revisionist history. But to the end, he believed he had done what was right. He just couldn't convince the country of it. And if Hoover was the ghost of good intentions gone wrong, his successor was a cocktail of charm and contradiction, radio-ready, movie-groomed, and ready to dance with destiny. Next comes the man with the $1 million smile and a Great Depression to bury, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't walk into the White House. He rolled in, smiling like a man who already knew history was watching. 4 terms, a world war, a depression, a wheelchair. A cigarette holder clenched between his teeth like punctuation. FDR wasn't just a presidente, was a performance, a polio-stricken patrician who turned suffering into strategy and charm into policy. Let's start with the legs, or rather, the lack of public awareness about them. Roosevelt contracted polio in 1921, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. But he crafted the illusion of motion, braces, canes, carefully staged appearances. Photographers were forbidden to capture him being lifted or wheeled. He stood with help. He walked with choreography. The performance was patriotic theater. He loved collecting stamps. Over 1 million of them. Had a special desk drawer just for sorting, organizing, and sometimes calming his nerves with perforated paper. He once paused a war meeting to examine a rare postage issue. World leaders waited. FDR squinted, then nodded. His cigarette holder was iconic. He'd clench it at a 45-degree angle like a permanent smirk. He used it for emphasis like a conductor's baton made of tobacco. He smoked constantly. Doctor's orders said cut back. He did, from 3 packs a day to 2. He had a thing for dogs. Fala, his Scottish terrier, was his constant companion. Fala had his own press releases, his own staff. He even had a minor scandal accused falsely of being flown back to the Aleutian Islands at taxpayer expense. Roosevelt publicly defended the dog in a speech. It worked. Fala's approval rating never dipped. FDR hosted cocktail hours in the White House, known as the Children's Hour, where political talk was banned. Anyone who brought up policy had to take a penalty drink. These were not casual affairs. They were emotional calibrations, charm offensives disguised as sherry parties. He adored magic tricks. Once invited a magician to perform at a cabinet meeting, pulled coins from under the Secretary of War's ear, laughed for 10 straight minutes. Said war was serious, so moments of levity were national necessity. He spoke like a god on the radio. His fireside chats were hypnotic. Millions tuned in. He wrote many himself, read drafts aloud until they sounded like conversation. Even when discussing bank collapses or World War, his voice felt like a warm quilt, reassurance, wrapped in cadence. He loved hot dogs, famously served them to the King and Queen of England in buns. With mustard, the British monarchy had never seen anything so gloriously undignified. The Queen asked if one used a fork. Roosevelt laughed and bit in. His desk was a mess. He kept letters, trinkets, coins, scraps of notes all jumbled, a chaos map of presidential thinking. He wrote memos in giant block letters, spaced wide enough for his failing eyesight to read them unaided. He refused to let polio define him, but privately he struggled, hid pain behind smiles, muscle spasms behind laughter. Only a few close aides ever saw the toll, but they all agreed his mind never wavered. He died in the 19th of April, -45, at Warm Springs, Georgia, while posing for a portrait. The unfinished painting still hangs a ghost in brushstrokes. His last words were, "I have a terrific headache." And after FDR, the world tilted. His successor wasn't elegant, wasn't prepped, wasn't even briefed on the atomic bomb. He entered the presidency like a man handed a live grenade and told to make a speech. Get ready for the blunt instrument of post-war history. Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman was not supposed to be president. He was supposed to be a placeholder, a quiet cog in the machine. When FDR died, Truman didn't even know where the bathroom was in the White House. He had been vice president for just 82 days, and FDR hadn't told him a thing. Not about the atomic bomb, not about the endgame in Europe, not about post-war plans. Just a handshake, a smile, and then nothing. So when the news came, Truman stood before reporters and said, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now." It wasn't poetic. It was pure Truman, blunt, nervous, and real. He was a haberdasher by trade, sold hats before politics, always looked sharp, clean lines, buttoned up, glasses perched perfectly. He walked like a man trying to keep up with fate, never slouched, never swaggered, just pushed forward, always forward. He loved playing the piano, played daily, sometimes in his underwear. Once gave a concert for an audience of stunned reporters, played ragtime with surprising flair, even accompanied his daughter Margaret, who was, according to most critics, an enthusiastic singer. When one reviewer insulted her performance, Truman didn't write a letter. He wrote a threat. A handwritten note that said, and this is a quote, "Someday I hope to meet you. When that happens, you'll need a new nose, a lot of beefsteak for black eyes, and perhaps a supporter below. Signed, Harry S. Truman, Presidential Diplomacy, Kansas City Style. Truman was the only president in history to use nuclear weapons. Twice, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He made the decision in days, quietly, with a heavy pen. He never apologized, believed it saved lives. But the weight of that choice bent his soul inward. His journals reveal a man wrestling with ghosts. "I have blood on my hands," he once scribbled in a margin. He woke at 5 a.m. every day, took brisk walks, always wore a suit, wrote letters in the morning, read the Bible before bed, carried a poem in his wallet titled "Man's a Fool." It reads, in part, "Man's a fool, he wants more wealth, then ruins his health to get more wealth." He quoted it often. He didn't drink, except for bourbon, and when he did, watch out. He could hold a grudge like a steel trap. Once refused to speak to a senator for a decade over a dinner snub. Didn't yell often, but when he did, windows trembled. He integrated the armed forces with a single executive order. No press release, no ceremony, just ink on paper. It was one of the most radical civil rights moves of the 20th century, and he did it without asking permission. He loved sayings, proverbs, one-liners. His desk bore the iconic plaque, "The buck stops here." Behind the smile was a man who knew exactly how heavy that buck could be. After leaving office, he refused a pension, said it felt wrong to take public money, lived modestly, took walks in town, wrote memoirs by hand, said of his time as president, "I tried to do what seemed right." He died in 1972. The world had changed a dozen times over. But Truman? He never stopped being a farmer in his bones, a soldier in his gut, and a hat seller in his soul. And now, from a man who dropped the bomb to one who dropped the country into paranoia, television, politics, and kitchen table diplomacy. Coming next, the 5 o'clock shadow of America's post-war anxiety, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't come to the presidency as a politician, he came as a conqueror. Supreme Allied Commander, Day Architect. A 5-star general who helped crush Nazi Germany, and then calmly, casually, stepped into the Oval Office like it was just another command post. His smile was warm, his eyes were flinty. His sentences were clipped like orders barked across a battlefield. But behind the grin and the medals was a man obsessed with golf, boiled meat, and the terrifying logic of nuclear obliteration. He loved golf, played more than 800 rounds while in office, had a putting green installed on the White House lawn. Once interrupted a national security briefing to ask if anyone knew where his 9-iron had gone. He also loved painting by numbers, found it relaxing. Eisenhower, architect of European victory, spent evenings filling in cartoon squirrels with tiny brushes. He ate like a soldier, meaning badly, boiled steaks, prune whip, bland toast, once banned salt from the White House kitchen. His wife Mamie smuggled it back in. She also added Tabasco to his eggs when he wasn't looking. It was the only way to keep him from tasting like a filing cabinet. Eisenhower hated emotional outbursts. He'd chew gum during cabinet meetings to keep from yelling. When furious, he'd grip the edge of the table and stare into the void. Staffers learned to fear the chewing. The faster it got, the closer you were to political annihilation. He warned against the military-industrial complex in his farewell address ironically, after helping create it. The man who led armies across continents also feared that tanks, contracts, and corporate power could eat the republic from the inside. His speeches were dry, but his warnings cut deep. "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence," he said. Few listened. He once invited Khrushchev to his farm in Gettysburg, fed him corn, showed him cattle, tried to convince the Soviet leader that Americans just wanted peace and property lines. Khrushchev was unimpressed, called it a pig farm. Eisenhower just laughed and offered him more corn. He didn't like the phone, preferred memos, dry, dense, punctuated like artillery reports. He drafted military-style orders to staff for lunch menus, flower arrangements, and office chairs. Everything had a chain of command, even the White House Christmas decorations. His anger ran deep but quiet. He never forgave Charles de Gaulle for being, in his words, a prima donna in a general's hat. He wrote letters to people he disliked, signed them with a flourish, then burned them in the fireplace. Said it cleared the system. He was bald, but meticulous about hats. Wore them at precise angles. Had a hat rack that was alphabetized by occasion. His suits were plain, pressed, and severe. He believed flash was weakness. He once told a young aide, "If your clothes are louder than your thoughts, you're not thinking hard enough." Eisenhower didn't love the presidency, called it a job that makes you feel like a jackass being kicked in both directions. But he served 2 full terms. Left with the country at peace, the highways being built, and the Cold War humming in the background like a distant storm. And now, from the general in a golf cart to the senator in a spotlight. A man who debated on television like he was born in a studio, who married Hollywood into the White House, and who styled America for the camera. Prepare for the entrance of the cleanest jawline in American political history, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy. John Fitzgerald Kennedy didn't just become presidente, became a myth. The jawline, the accent, the motorcade, Camelot in the age of Cold War dread. JFK wasn't just a man, he was a brand before branding existed. A political prince in a tailored suit, flashing a smile that could deflect a missile. But underneath the sleek exterior was a mess of painkillers, secrets, and chaos sewn together by charisma and amphetamines. Let's start with the health. He looked invincible. He wasn't. Kennedy suffered from Addison's disease, a debilitating adrenal disorder, also chronic back pain, also ulcers, also colitis. He wore a back brace, had trouble standing for long periods, and needed daily injections just to function. At one point, he was taking over 10 medications a day. Vitamins, steroids, barbiturates, painkillers, mood stabilizers, all carefully managed by a doctor nicknamed Dr. Feelgood, who traveled with a suitcase full of solutions and no second opinions. And yet, JFK sparkled in public. He was the first truly telegenic president, the first to look better on screen than in person. He debated Nixon on live television and won not with policy, but posture. He wore dark suits that popped. Nixon sweated. Kennedy shimmered. America took one look at the camera and said, "That guy." He kept a coconut on his desk. Not just any coconut, the one he used to carve a rescue message after his PT boat was sunk in World War II. He gave the coconut to a local islander. It made its way back to him. That same coconut got lacquered and framed in a gold case. It sat in the Oval Office while he negotiated with Khrushchev over nuclear annihilation. He also loved baths, took multiple a day, even during crises. There's a photo of him in the White House tub, reading a newspaper, surrounded by rubber ducks. He believed immersion cleared the mind. Also, he often answered calls naked. Staff learned to just accept it. He hated wearing hats, refused to do it. Killed the American hat industry, essentially. One man's windswept hair became another man's unemployment line. He believed your hairstyle should match your confidence. He loved speed, boats, cars, women, kept a secret White House pool, had it covered over later by LBJ, but for a time, it was the scene of whispered escapades. He had affairs many, reckless, sometimes dangerous. One of them, possibly with a woman tied to East German intelligence. Another, Marilyn Monroe. He loved practical jokes, hid buzzers in doorknobs, would call foreign leaders at odd hours just to test if they were alert. Once called the British Prime Minister and pretended to be drunk. Another time, ordered a staffer to deliver a speech backward. He hated oatmeal, loved soup, would drink multiple bowls in a day, hated air conditioning, slept with windows open, always, even in winter. He was a cold warrior, but preferred poetry, quoted Frost, read Hemingway, wrote speeches like short stories. His inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you," was under 15 minutes. But it burned into the American memory like scripture. And then came Dallas. The 22nd of November, 1963. A car, a rifle, a Zapruder film. Camelot shattered in 26.6 seconds. His death marked the end of the age of illusions. But his successor? He was no illusion. He was real, raw, and relentless. A Texas bulldozer with a pen in one hand and your lapel in the other. Prepare for the arm-twisting, ego-flattening, bathroom-politicking force of nature. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson was not subtle. He was a human landslide, a juggernaut of political will, ego, and southern thunder. Where JFK was elegance and myth, LBJ was sweat, profanity, and raw horsepower. He didn't charm, he didn't persuade. He cornered you in the bathroom and passed legislation while buttoning his fly. He didn't ask loomed. The Johnson treatment was not a tactic, it was a weather system. He was 6'4", with ears like radar dishes and eyes that could bore holes into drywall. When he got close, and he always got close, he'd lean in, nostrils flaring, finger jabbing, whispering in a voice that started as a purr and built to a cattle stampede. Senators folded, staffers trembled. Fountains ran dry. He could pass a bill with a raised eyebrow and a follow-up stare. LBJ owned dozens of suits, all cut wide in the shoulders and high in the pants. But he was most comfortable in his bathrobe or no robe at all. He'd hold meetings from the toilet, literally, door open. Guests seated. Johnson mid-deposit, discussing Vietnam or poverty reform without missing a beat. He called it multitasking. Everyone else called it traumatic. He had a special shower installed in the White House, 6 nozzles, full-body blast. Called it the Johnson pressure wash. If you got near his bathroom, you could hear the roar like an industrial car wash doing battle with a garden center. He had a dog named him, another named her. When him sired puppies, LBJ gave them away like political favors. You vote right, and you get a beagle. He once lifted him by the ears in front of reporters. National scandal. Johnson shrugged. Dogs like it, he said. Him did not comment. He was obsessed with his Johnson, referred to it as Jumbo, bragged about it, flashed it, gave staffers running commentary while urinating, had his tailor sew special room into his pants. There's an actual audio recording of him ordering custom trousers, requesting more space under the bunghole. And yet, in that same wide suit, LBJ carried a pen that signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, PBS, and dozens more. The man legislated like he was building a country from scratch, brick by brick, with a bulldozer and zero time to ask permission. He kept a giant light-up map of the U.S. in his office, pressed buttons to illuminate districts, called congressmen and said, "I see your county, I know your votes," then made them vote his way. He gave gifts in bulk, pens, cufflinks, barbecue sauce. Wrote handwritten notes every morning to friends, enemies, senators, janitors. Politics, to Johnson, was deeply personal and exhaustingly constant. Vietnam broke him. He escalated. Then escalated again. Thought he could outmaneuver war like he did Congress. Couldn't, protesters screamed. Approval plummeted. He began sleeping with the lights on. Kept tape recorders rolling in every room. Trusted no one fully. He announced he wouldn't seek re-election in 1968, stunning the nation. When he died in 1973, he was reading newspapers alone in bed. The man who once moved mountains with a phone call died mid-sentence, silent for once. But silence would not last long, because coming next was the man who whispered into microphones, bugged every office, and once talked to portraits at night. The paranoia, the power. The Shakespearean spiral. Prepare yourself for the long, slow burn of Richard Milhous Nixon. Richard Nixon. Richard Milhous Nixon wasn't born in the shadows, but he made them his home. If other presidents were portraits, Nixon was a political X-ray all nerves, paranoia, and jagged ambition. He rose from poverty to the pinnacle, then fell with a crash so loud it still echoes through history. His story is Shakespearean, his voice unmistakable, and his habits, well, bizarre. He loved ketchup. On cottage cheese. That was his breakfast of champions. Cottage cheese, sliced pineapple, and ketchup, carefully dolloped like a condiment crime scene. He ate it in silence, sometimes staring into space like he was plotting against the fruit. He talked to the portraits in the White House, especially Lincoln, would stand in the East Room late at night, alone, whispering strategies and regrets to Honest Abe's oil-painted eyes. Staffers avoided that hallway after dark, said it felt wrong. He kept the thermostat at meat locker levels. The White House during Nixon's years? A frozen tomb of tape recorders and wool suits. Visitors wore overcoats indoors. He claimed it helped him think. Aides claimed it helped keep them awake. He recorded everything, every meeting, every phone call, every breath of conversation. Over 3,700 hours of tape. He believed the tapes would vindicate him, show history how hard he worked, how smart he was. Instead, they buried him in his own voice. He was obsessed with bowling, had a private one-lane alley installed beneath the White House, bowled badly, often, alone. Said it released tension. Rumor has it he'd talked to the pins before rolling, coaching them on how to fall. He hated confrontation, would fire people via memo, or worse, by having someone else do it. He loathed awkward goodbyes. Once had an aide resign via post-it note, and Nixon kept the note in his wallet for a week, staring at it during lunch. He loved long walks on the beach, alone, fully dressed in a suit and wingtip shoes, pacing the California coastline like a sad shark in leather soles. A Secret Service agent once offered him sandals. Nixon muttered, "I don't need sandals. I need silence." He took sleeping pills nightly and woke to a carefully orchestrated routine of memos, clippings, and press summaries. Everything filtered, everything trimmed. He didn't want news. He wanted ammunition. He never truly trusted anyone. Not Kissinger, not Haldeman, not the press, especially not the press. He once told an aide, "The press is the enemy," then repeated it 3 times. Like an incantation. Watergate began as a Blipa burglary, some wiretaps, an ugly thread. Nixon tugged at it. It snapped. The unraveling was epic. Denials, leaks, resignations, tape after tape after tape. "I am not a crook," he declared on national television. America blinked. History laughed. In the 19th of August, -74, he became the first and only president to resign. He boarded Marine One, gave the V for Victory sign, and vanished into the smog of California exile. But he didn't disappear. He wrote books, gave interviews, reinvented himself as a foreign policy elder statesman, whispered advice to presidents, visited the White House again, shook hands with his past. He died in 1994. At his funeral, both enemies and allies called him complex. That was polite. Nixon wasn't complex. He was contradictions stacked in trench coats and jowls. A man who trusted no one but tape. Gerald Ford. Gerald R. Ford was never supposed to be president. He didn't run for the job. He didn't want the job. He got it the way someone wins a haunted house in a rigged raffle. Nixon resigned. Spiro Agnew was long gone, and suddenly Boomford was in the Oval Office, blinking under fluorescent lights, a decent man trapped in an indecent moment. He was the only president never elected to the presidency, or vice presidency. A political unicorn. One day he's House Minority Leader, the next he's being sworn in by Chief Justice Berger, while the ink on Nixon's resignation letter is still drying. Ford's greatest strength? He was normal. Painfully, Midwesternly, khaki pants at a barbecue normal. He ate cottage cheese and cantaloupe for lunch. Every day. He watched football religiously, cheered for Michigan, and had the energy of a substitute gym teacher trying to explain how civics works. He fell. A lot. Downstairs, off-ramps, on golf courses. Once, while exiting Air Force One, he slipped, tumbled, and popped back up like nothing happened. America laughed. Ford laughed too, but the clumsy president image stuck, even though he was an all-American football star at the University of Michigan. The man could tackle a linebacker, but couldn't dodge a rain-slick stairway. He chewed Trident gum constantly. His desk was littered with packs. Staff joked he could broker peace with peppermint. He wore brown suits so aggressively neutral they made the Oval Office look overdressed. He used a pipe as a prop not lit, just held. Said it made him look thoughtful. He had a golden retriever named Liberty who roamed the White House freely, once interrupting a cabinet meeting by vomiting on the carpet. Ford wiped it up himself. Didn't call staff. Didn't panic. Just shrugged. Dogs have opinions too, he said. He slept well. No insomnia. No 3 a.m. pacing. While crises churned around him post-Vietnam collapse, economic stagflation, assassination attempts, Ford went to bed at 10 o'clock and woke up at 6 o'clock. The country was on fire, and he was snoring through it like it was finals week in a dorm room. Speaking of assassination attempt, she survived 2 in the same month. Both women, both in California. One was a Charles Manson follower, the other pointed a gun at him and misfired. Ford ducked, kept walking, and later asked, "What's next on the schedule?" He loved vetoes, used them like fly swat, 66 rupees in total. Congress would send him laws, Ford would send back no in block letters. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He just believed in fiscal restraint, the way some people believe in astrology. But then came the pardon. Nixon. 1 month into office, Ford pardoned him for all offenses against the United States. America exploded. Approval ratings fell off a cliff. Conspiracy theories multiplied. Ford insisted it was to heal the nation. Historians still debate it. But in that moment, Gerald Ford became a political lightning rod and never fully recovered. He lost re-election in 1976, narrowly, graciously, handshake at the ready, no bitterness, no memoirs filled with spite, just golf, grandkids, and speeches about leadership. He lived until 2006, outlasting Cold War tensions, internet debates, and 5 more presidents. Ford's legacy? Steady hands in a nose-diving cockpit, a calm voice in a chaos storm, a man who tripped, pardoned, and vetoed his way into history not with flair, but with stubborn, stumbling decency. And now, from a president who pardoned power to a man who preached humility, a peanut farmer, a Sunday school teacher, a nuclear engineer who loved Habitat for Humanity more than headlines. Next, the earnest, tireless, quietly controversial presidency of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was the only U.S. president who once lived in public housing, and it showed. Not in his clothes or his speeches, but in his soul. He came to Washington not with swagger, but with sermons. Not to rule, but to serve. A peanut farmer turned nuclear engineer turned Georgia governor turned president, and yet he never quite fit in. The beltway chewed on Carter like gristle it couldn't swallow. He carried his own luggage, on Air Force One, in front of reporters, refused limousines when a regular car would do, walked down Pennsylvania Avenue after his inauguration like he was late for Sunday service. The Secret Service panicked. Carter just smiled and waved. He taught Sunday school while president, at a Baptist church in D.C., taught lessons, answered questions, led prayers, once delayed a cabinet meeting to finish discussing the book of Micah. His staff sat waiting, unsure whether to be annoyed or converted. He was the first president born in a hospital, slept only 5 hours a night, woke at 5:30 a.m., read briefing memos with black coffee, and ran 6 miles in worn-down sneakers. Had a weird thing about scheduling. He logged every minute of his day. Staffers said he scheduled time to schedule things. This was not a metaphor. It was a spreadsheet. Carter didn't drink, hated small talk. Once called a cocktail party a swamp of meaningless smiles. He preferred crisis meetings, deep reading, and thermostat adjustments. Speaking of which, he famously turned down the White House heat, told Americans to wear sweaters, gave a televised address from the Oval Office in one. America laughed, then froze. The malaise speech wasn't actually the word malaise, but it stuck like frostbite. He was a micromanager, reviewed office supply orders, edited speeches word by word, personally reviewed the wine list for state dinners. Once wrote marginalia on budget memos like, "Why do we need 2,000 new pens? If there were typos, someone heard about it. If there was waste, someone was fired." He had a pet Siamese cat named Misty Malarkey Yin Yang. Yes, really. The cat had its own pillow in the Lincoln bedroom. Carter thought it helped balance the energy in the room. He also believed in UFOs. Publicly admitted he saw one in 1969. A bright white object. Never said it was aliens. Never said it wasn't. He loved to fish. Terribly. Once, while out in a boat, a swamp rabbit swam toward him, hissing. The Secret Service panicked. Carter shooed it off with an oar. The media dubbed it the Killer Rabbit Incident. Political cartoonists had a field day. Carter just shook his head and said, "It was a weird rabbit." Internationally, he brokered peace between Egypt and Israel, Camp David Accords, a miracle of diplomacy done with handshakes, shouting, and scripture. Domestically, inflation skyrocketed. Gas lines stretched for blocks. And then came the Iran hostage crisis, 444 days of captivity that slowly unraveled his approval ratings like a sweater caught on a nail. He lost re-election in a landslide, smiled, shook hands, walked out of the White House with the same humility he walked in with. Then spent the next 4 decades building homes, monitoring elections, eradicating disease, and teaching Sunday school. Again. Carter didn't just leave a legacy, lived one. A man too honest for politics, too precise for chaos, too early for the postmodern mess that came next. Because after Carter came the cowboy showman, the Hollywood candidate, the former governor with a jelly bean jar and a nuclear arsenal. Next, Ronald Reagan, the actor who played the president and then became one. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a Hollywood actor who became president and somehow made it look like he'd been preparing for the role his entire life. He brought a smile to nuclear brinksmanship, a cowboy twang to Cold War diplomacy, and a jar of jelly beans to every high-stakes meeting. He didn't run the country like a general or a professor. He ran it like a screenwriter with punchlines, camera angles, and a firm belief that every scene needed a hero. He was the oldest man elected president at the time, 69 years old, but America saw him as the national grandfather, warm, twinkly-eyed, slightly deaf, and never far from a folksy metaphor. His favorite? Trust, but verify. Said it to Gorbachev so often it became a running joke between them. Reagan laughed. Gorbachev probably didn't. He loved jelly beans, always had a jar nearby. Favorite flavor? Licorice. Disgusting, yes. But Strategic said the act of eating them kept him from smoking. He'd offer them to guests, staff, even visiting dignitaries. Queen Elizabeth? Jelly bean. G7 leaders? Jelly beans. Nuclear summit? Definitely jelly beans. He took naps, daily, scheduled, defended them as presidential recharging. Staff learned not to disturb him between 1 and 2 p.m. The red phone could ring, missiles could be en route. Reagan would be snoozing. He loved astrology. Or rather, Nancy Reagan did, and she controlled his schedule with it. After his 1981 assassination attempt, she brought in an astrologer to vet travel days and press conferences. Entire foreign policy decisions were rescheduled because Mercury was in retrograde. He believed in UFOs, genuinely. Once gave a speech suggesting aliens might unite humanity. Told Gorbachev the same thing. Gorbachev stared. Reagan nodded, solemnly. He wasn't joking. He wore suits like armor, always tailored. Hair? Never moved. It was a perfectly styled Cold War helmet. He once had to be physically restrained from cutting his own hair before a summit. Staff said he thought it looked too soft. He called the USSR the evil empire. Then later shook Gorbachev's hand and helped end the Cold War. He believed in peace through strength, but made it sound like a bedtime story. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," he said in Berlin. Everyone thought it was a nice line. It became a historical echo. He was shot in 1981, took a bullet to the chest, cracked jokes while bleeding out, told the surgeons, "I hope you're all Republicans," told his wife, "Sorry, honey, I forgot to duck." America gasped. Reagan winked. His approval rating soared. He watched old movies alone in the White House theater. His own movies, would critique them, said his early westerns lacked depth, believed movies taught people morality. Had a stack of VHS tapes taller than a staffer. Yes, he used VHS. He often told the same stories, repeated phrases, forgot names. In private, staff worried. In public, America smiled. The term Teflon president was invented for him. Nothing stuck. Not Iran-Contra, not deficits, not misspoken dates or names. He floated above scandal like a weather balloon full of charm. He left office in 1989, waving like a matinee idol fading into sunset. Later diagnosed with Alzheimer's, faded, slowly, gracefully, wrote a letter to the nation. "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life." Ronald Reagan didn't just act presidential, he acted the presidency. And he made America believe in the role even when the script was flawed. But after Reagan's movie ended, the next president was no actor. He was a resume in human form. A World War II pilot, a CIA director, an oil man, a vice president, a handshake, a yawn. Enter George H.W. Bush, the man who knew everyone, did everything, and somehow still seemed like a mystery. George H.W. Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush was a man built from diplomacy, stitched from service, and wrapped in the cardigan of polite conservatism. He was a World War II hero, a Yale-educated oilman, UN ambassador, CIA director, congressman, vice president, and finally, president. If resumes ran for office, his would have crushed the ballot box. Yet, despite all the credentials, all the contacts, and all the code-named courage, he was, to many Americans, just a guy who said, "Read my lips," and then raised their taxes. Let's start with the voice. Reedy, high-pitched, constantly peppered with half-mumbled phrases like, "wouldn't be prudent," and "not gonna do it." Dana Carvey built a career mocking that voice. Bush Sr. loved it. Invited Carvey to the White House, laughed harder than anyone else, because Bush had something few politicians possessed: humility. He wrote thank you notes, hundreds, maybe thousands, in pen, by hand, for staffers, janitors, friends, political opponents, If you held a door for George H.W. Bush, there was a 60% chance you got a note in the mail the next week. He skydived at age 72, then again at 75, then again at 80, wore socks covered in Superman logos, said they made him feel light on his feet, refused to stop eating pork rinds, called them my snack of choice. When a food journalist mocked them, he invited her to the White House and served them with caviar. He hated broccoli, publicly, said the president shouldn't have to eat it. Broccoli farmers protested by sending literal tons of the vegetable to 1,600 Pennsylvania Ave. Bush shrugged, donated it all, never ate a floret. He banned talking during tennis matches. At the White House tennis court, staff were known to hold their breath while he played. He was good, competitive, wore headbands, grunted like McEnroe. His second favorite sport? Letter writing. He was obsessed with decorum, would call senators after heated exchanges just to say, "No hard feelings, pal." Had a habit of saying, "This will not stand," in press conferences. It became a kind of catchphrase, somewhere between a rebuke and a dad joke. When the Berlin Wall fell, he didn't throw a parade, didn't gloat, didn't even raise his voice. "I'm not going to dance on the wall," he said. It was classic Bush. Respectful, restrained, calculated. He believed America's power should be global, but never gaudy. He won the Gulf War in 100 hours, built a coalition, pushed Saddam out of Kuwait, then stopped, didn't invade Baghdad, said it would be a quagmire. History took notes. His approval rating soared over 90%. Then the economy tanked, the deficit ballooned. He raised taxes despite the famous promise, "Read my lips, no new taxes," political suicide. And he knew it. He lost re-election in 1992, took it with grace. Left a handwritten note on the Oval Office desk for Bill Clinton. "Your success is now our country's success. I am rooting hard for you." It's one of the most admired transitions of power in American history. In retirement, he took up painting, parachuting, and friendship with Bill Clinton. They became odd couple buddies, Clinton the sax-playing rascal, Bush the cardigan-wearing elder statesman. Together they toured disaster zones, raised money, laughed, and redefined post-presidency bromance. George H.W. Bush died in 2018, draped in war medals, handwritten letters, and a lifetime of service. His funeral brought together rivals, allies, generations. And it reminded America that decency, when done right, can be its own kind of power. But decency would soon collide with saxophones, scandals, and a whole lot of lip-biting empathy. Because coming next is the man who felt your pain, dodged your questions, and debated with a wink. Welcome to the paradox and political magic trick of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was a walking paradox, with a saxophone in one hand and a scandal folder in the other. He was charisma weaponized, a southern fried intellectual who could quote Aristotle, then devour a Big Mac in the back of a limo. He played jazz on late-night talk shows, cried at funerals like a method actor, and governed with the chaotic energy of a dorm room debate moderator who forgot to take his Ritalin. He was born in Hope, Arkansas, literally and figuratively, and rose from poverty to the presidency faster than most people finish college. He could charm a room full of skeptics, remember names for decades, and connect with factory workers and Ivy Leaguers in the same breath. Clinton didn't just want to win, he needed you to like him. It was less politics, more addiction. He loved McDonald's. Famously, once led his Secret Service detail on an unplanned jog straight to the drive-thru. He ordered fries, a shake, and talked foreign policy between bites. The staff was stunned. Clinton grinned. America shrugged and kept watching. He also had a photographic memory, could recall entire conversations, obscure quotes, and state-level demographic data without blinking. Aides would watch him read policy briefs at lightning speed, then recite them verbatim. He was a policy wonk in Elvis's body part think tank, part rock concert. He played the saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show, wore sunglasses, played Heartbreak Hotel. America hadn't seen a president perform like that since Washington crossed the Delaware standing up. The crowd lost it. Voters swooned. Boomers rediscovered the thrill of politics. But Clinton's charm was his power and his curse. He couldn't say no. Not to food, not to applause, not to, well, Monica. The Lewinsky scandal blew up his presidency like a daytime soap plotline. The blue dress, the cigar, the deposition, the phrase, "It depends on what the meaning of is." He was impeached, acquitted, survived with approval ratings north of 60%. He loved to debate, would go on for hours, took pride in filibustering his own advisors. Once spent 45 minutes answering a single voter question in a town hall, not because he had to, because he wanted to. The man couldn't resist a spotlight, a whiteboard, and a complicated question about Medicaid funding. He had a sleep schedule that would kill a mortal. 4 to 5 hours a night, read late into the morning, took power naps while standing. Staff learned to wake him with policy updates, whispered like lullabies. He loved Elvis, owned memorabilia, quoted him. Once described economic recovery as all shook up, said he wanted to be remembered as a man who tried, then played Don't Be Cruel at a fundraiser and nailed the high notes. His administration saw booming markets, the dot-com bubble, welfare reform, and the lowest unemployment rates in decades. But it also saw failed healthcare reform, the Rwandan genocide ignored, and a legacy stained by scandal. Clinton left office with a complicated reputation, brilliant, broken, beloved, and bruised. He reinvented himself as a global philanthropist, a statesman, and the awkward +1 to Hillary's Senate runs and presidential campaigns. He was a contradiction wrapped in a sax solo, a Rhodes Scholar with a wandering eye, a president who could cry at a funeral, laugh at a roast, and win any room he walked into. And now, from charisma overload to black and white certainty, the cowboy intellectual, the man who saw evil, called it out, and went to war with it. Strap in for the disciplined, defiant, and destiny-obsessed presidency of George W. Bush. George W. Bush. George W. Bush came to the presidency like a man late to class, but sure, the quiz would be easy. The second son of a president, the first since Adams to do it. He was equal parts Texan swagger, frat house charm, and earnest confusion. He mispronounced nuclear, nicknamed reporters like camp counselors, and once almost choked to death on a pretzel while watching football. He was a paradox. The president you'd have a beer with if he hadn't quit drinking years earlier. He called himself the decider, not the commander, not the leader, the decider, as in, I make decisions, some of them are right. That's a direct quote. He also once said, I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully. Another direct quote. George W. Bush was the walking embodiment of malapropism. The English language never quite forgave him. He painted his own pets. Later, post-presidency, he took up art and painted dogs, world leaders, and veterans. But even during office, he saw himself as a kind of cowboy-in-chief, direct, folksy, rooted in values. His jokes were groan-worthy, his speeches occasionally baffling, but his instincts at least early on were locked and loaded. Then came the September 2001. One of the defining moments of the modern presidency. Bush was reading The Pet Goat to a classroom of kids when his chief of staff whispered in his ear, America is under attack. Bush nodded, finished the story, then stood up and walked into history. He addressed the nation that night, stood on the rubble of Ground Zero days later with a bullhorn. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon. It was raw, unfiltered, America rallied. He created the Department of Homeland Security, signed the Patriot Act, launched the War on Terror, first Afghanistan, then Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction were never found, but Saddam Hussein was. Captured, hanged, the war dragged on, so did the criticism. He dodged a shoe in Iraq. Literally, a protester threw it at him. Bush ducked, grinned. All I can report, he said, is it's a size 10. That was classic W, humor deflecting tension, charm covering nerves. He ran every morning, early, fast, sometimes with the Secret Service panting behind. He read the Bible daily, played a mean hand of poker, gave everyone nicknames. Karl Rove was Turd Blossom. Vladimir Putin was Pooty Poot. That wasn't diplomacy. That was dubia. He banned broccoli from Air Force One, called it the Devil's Tree. Wrote thank you notes on napkins, took naps at 1 p.m. sharp, kept early dinners, firm handshakes, and an ironclad belief in gut instincts. After Hurricane Katrina, he stood at a disaster zone and said, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job," to FEMA Director Michael Brown. Brown resigned days later. Bush's approval plummeted. The moment became symbolic of disconnect, detachment. The financial crisis hit in 2008. Housing market collapsed, banks melted, bailouts passed. Bush, battered and blinking, handed off the presidency with one final self-aware line. "I hope you feel the same sense of pride I do." He retired to Texas, painted, rode bikes, raised awareness for wounded veterans. Slowly, the public began to reassess him not as a flawless leader, but as a flawed man who tried, who stumbled, and who never stopped smiling through it. Because, whatever you think of George W. Bush, he never pretended to be anyone but George W. Bush. And now, from boots and brush clearing to hope and audacity, a senator from Chicago, a constitutional scholar, a man with a rhythm to his rhetoric and a teleprompter like a dance partner. Get ready for the cool, complicated symphony of Barack Obama. Barack Obama. Barack Obama didn't just run for president, he arrived. Like a chord progression no one had heard before. Smooth, rhythmic, inevitable. The first black president. The first social media president. The first to make policy sound like poetry. He was jazz in a suit, calm in a crisis, and sharp enough to roast you with a smile and leave you grateful for the privilege. He wrote books before he won office. Dreams from My Father read like it belonged in a lit class, not a campaign trail. He spoke in paragraphs, not sound bites. Quoted Lincoln, then Jay-Z. Could move from drone policy to the Chicago Bulls in one breath, and did it without blinking. His presidential playlists were legendary. Springsteen, Beyonce, Coltrane, Kendrick. Every summer, he'd drop his personal Spotify list, and suddenly, America was slow dancing to Otis Redding in bipartisan harmony. He was, quite literally, the first president with a banger. He was born in Hawaii, raised in Indonesia, studied at Harvard, taught constitutional law, carried himself like the smartest guy in every room, and somehow still made you feel like you were the one with the good ideas, unless you interrupted him mid-thought. Then he'd freeze, blink, whisper, "Let me finish," and you'd feel the weight of history press pause. He loved basketball, played pickup games with staff, had a decent jump shot, fierce left hand, trash talked just enough. Once blocked Reggie Love, his body man, then called a press conference to make sure the story got told. He hated drama, called his administration No Drama Obama. Problems? Cool analysis. Chaos? Lower his voice. He survived 8 years in the Oval Office and somehow made it seem chill. Until it wasn't. He inherited a financial disaster, banks collapsing, auto industry gasping, passed a stimulus package, saved Detroit, got flack for Wall Street bailouts, but the Dow recovered, jobs trickled back. Housing stabilized. And suddenly, people were buying Hope t-shirts again. He passed the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, after a brutal legislative brawl. It expanded coverage to over 20 million Americans. Republicans called it socialism. Democrats called it insufficient. He called it a big F. ING. Okay, Joe Biden did. Obama just smiled. He killed Osama bin Laden, greenlit the raid, watched in real time as SEAL Team 6 ghosted through Pakistan. When it was done, he told the world in a calm, quiet address, "Justice has been done. No fireworks, no swagger, just history." He read 10 letters from Americans every night, personally. Said it kept him grounded. Staff handpicked them. Stories of pain, of triumph, of rage. He'd write back sometimes. Long letters, emotional ones, policy written in ink and empathy. He was a president with playlists, punchlines, and nerves of steel, but not without flaws. He increased drone strikes, deported record numbers, failed to close Guantanamo. Syria burned. Gridlock hardened, hope dimmed for some. Still, he gave speeches that brought tears and goosebumps. Charleston, Selma, Sandy Hook. And at the end, with gray in his hair and legacy in debate, he said, "Yes, we did." Post-presidency? He surfed, signed Netflix deals, dropped memoirs, DJ'd for the country's conscience, and watched quietly, carefully as the White House passed to his antithesis. Because after the professor came the wild card, the disruptor, the brand, the spectacle. Get ready for the uncensored, unfiltered, and utterly unprecedented phenomenon of Donald J. Trump. Donald J. Trump. Donald J. Trump didn't run for president the traditional way. He descended literally down a golden escalator, hair swept back like a defiant tidal wave, tie too long, speech unscripted. Within minutes, he shattered political norms, then made that demolition his campaign slogan. Make America Great Again wasn't just a hat, was a signal flare. The reality television president had entered the realest job on earth. Trump was a billionaire kind of, a mogul, a tabloid fixture, the man who branded steaks, vodka, airlines, and universities with his own last name. He was famous not for what he did, but for how loudly he did it. And in 2016, he bulldozed through 16 Republican challengers. Then Hillary Clinton, powered by Twitter, cable news, and a supercharged base that mistook chaos for candor. He didn't read daily briefs. He watched Fox News. He didn't follow talking points. He was the talking point. Trump governed by tweet, 280 characters at a time. Foreign policy, personnel changes, nuclear threats all blasted from a phone, often before sunrise. It wasn't a presidency, it was a feed. He called his own attorney general disloyal, his chief of staff overrated, his enemies, losers, dogs, total disasters. He referred to himself in the third person. Nobody knows more about taxes than me. I alone can fix it, and, famously, I'm a very stable genius. He didn't just bend the truth, he folded it into origami. Fact-checkers drowned. The Washington Post documented over 30,000 false or misleading claims. Trump's defense? Fake news. A phrase that mutated into a weapon aimed at anything inconvenient. He hosted rallies like rock concerts, red hats, thunderous chants, a soundtrack of 80s power ballads. He joked, jabbed, monologued, talked about dishwashers, windmills, and shark attacks. People cheered like prophets were speaking. He was impeached, twice. First for pressuring Ukraine to investigate Biden, then for inciting the 6th of January insurrection. Both times, acquitted. His response? Perfect call. Witch hunt. Total hoax. COVID-19 hit. Trump downplayed it. pushed miracle cures, floated disinfectant as treatment, refused masks, caught the virus, recovered in 3 days. Then stood on the White House balcony and saluted the air like a wartime president in a Marvel film. He appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, rewrote immigration policy, slashed environmental protections, pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran deal, the WHO, rewrote American diplomacy in all caps. He refused to concede the 2020 election, claimed massive fraud, sued everyone, lost, then summoned supporters to Washington. The Capitol was breached, flags waved, glass shattered. Congress fled. 5 died. America watched in horror. The 6th of January redefined the Trump presidency. And yet, millions still supported him, loved him, believed him. To them, he was the outsider who spoke their anger out loud. He left office without attending the inauguration, flew to Florida, golfed, posted statements like tweets carved into marble. His political future? Undead, looming, announced a 2024 run. Because Trump never truly leaves the stage, he just waits for the next cue. Donald Trump didn't redefine the presidency, he detonated it. And now, the man cleaning up the blast zone is the oldest to ever hold the office. A steady hand. A stutterer turned statesman. A man who's been waiting 50 years for the top job. Next up, the long-awaited whisperer of democracy, Joseph R. Biden Jr. Joseph R. Biden Jr. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. was the political equivalent of a weathered paperback creased, familiar, occasionally out of breath, but deeply underlined by time. He took office in 2021 as the oldest president in U.S. history. At 78, Biden had spent nearly 50 years orbiting the Oval Office. Senator at 29, vice president to Obama, and then, finally, president after 3 runs, 1 pandemic, and 1 insurgency. Biden didn't stride into office. He limped, emotionally and politically, into a country on fire. COVID-19 raging. The Capitol freshly looted, democracy wheezing. And there he was, hair thinning, voice raspy, eyes squinting like he'd seen too much, because he had. He's known for his stutter, still shows up, especially when he's tired. But Biden never hid it, turned it into a story of resilience. Told kids, if I can do it, so can you. His speeches sometimes wander, so do his thoughts. He leans on note cards, then tosses them mid-sentence. He calls people folks and uses the word malarkey like it's 19 to 42. He rides Amtrak, religiously, clocked over 2 million miles as a senator, knew conductors by name, memorized stations like they were war zones. He called the Delaware to D.C. route home. Said it gave him time to think, grieve, and plan. Sometimes all at once. He's known for his empathy. It's not performative. He's buried a wife, a daughter, and a son. Loss clings to him like a second suit. When someone weeps in front of him, he doesn't flinch. He leans in, whispers, grabs their hand, says, I know, because he does. He brought a German shepherd named Major to the White House first rescue dog in presidential history. Major, bit a Secret Service agent, twice. Was sent to behavioral re-education because even Biden's dogs were trying to adjust to D.C. He loves ice cream, like obsessively. Chocolate chip is his holy grail. He's been known to pause interviews to eat it, holds it like a diplomatic flag, mentions it in speeches. My name's Joe Biden, and I love ice cream, is a line he's actually used multiple times. He presides over a polarized nation with razor-thin margins in Congress, passed a massive COVID relief bill, pushed through infrastructure, faced inflation, supply chain snarls, Afghanistan's chaotic withdrawal, Roe v. Wade overturned on his watch. His speeches turned somber, then fiery, then back to soft murmurs and aviators. He uses phrases like, "Here's the deal," and "not a joke." Often repeats stories, calls opponents "my friend," right before politically gutting them. Still whispers into the mic for effect. Sometimes yells. Sometimes forgets what state he's in. America watches with half cringes and full prayers. And yet, his approval oscillates. A president powered by contrast. To Trump, to chaos, to youth. Biden doesn't promise revolution. He promises a full sentence. One that ends with a handshake, and maybe a bipartisan vote. He'll go down as the last of his kind. A Cold War relic running a TikTok democracy. His legacy? Still writing itself in slow, deliberate pen strokes. And there it is. 46 men. 50 states. 2.5 centuries of bizarre, haunted, glorious, embarrassing, electric presidential fact. A republic of contradictions led by contradictions. Because the strangest thing about US presidents is that they keep happening.